In the shadows of New York's underworld, Albert Anastasia carved his name in blood, leaving behind a legacy of fear and betrayal. But as his reign crumbled, the question remained: could a man who lived by violence ever escape the darkness that consumed him? Albert Anastasia was born in 1902 in the small town of Tropea, nestled along the rocky shores of Calabria, Italy. His family was poor, struggling to make ends meet in a country where opportunities were scarce and survival was a daily battle. His father, a humble fisherman, cast his nets into the unforgiving sea, hoping for a catch that would feed his family. But the sea didn't always cooperate. It was a life where hunger and hardship were constant companions. Albert, from a young age, knew the weight of that struggle. The streets were a mix of dirt, dust, and the sharp scent of salt water that never quite left your skin. He learned early that the world wasn't kind, and that sometimes it wasn't enough to just survive, you had to fight for a place in it. By the time he was a teenager, the weight of his family's poverty grew too heavy for him to bear. Like many young men from his village, Albert made the decision to leave, to find something better on the other side of the ocean. In 1919, he boarded a ship bound for America, just another poor Italian looking for a chance. The streets of New York were no more forgiving than those he had left behind. But here, the stakes were higher. This was the land of opportunity, yes, but also a land of crime, corruption, and men who didn't play by the rules. It was the perfect breeding ground for a young man like Albert, who had nothing but ambition and the ability to survive. He arrived in the Lower East Side, where the air was thick with the smell of sweat and gasoline, where the noise never stopped, and where the streets were paved with broken dreams. The neighborhoods were a patchwork of immigrants, each group clinging to their old world while struggling to navigate the new. Albert, with his sharp eyes and cold demeanor, quickly learned how to survive in this urban jungle. He became part of the fabric of New York's underworld, slowly moving up through the ranks of the criminal empire. In the early days, he did what was necessary to survive: petty thefts, small-time hustles, and taking the odd job for a few dollars. But that wasn't enough. Albert had bigger plans, and he wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. The Italian mafia, with its intricate network of power and its ruthless enforcers, would become his home. His rise through its ranks was swift, fueled by a fearsome reputation that began to spread. By the time he was in his 20s, Albert wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was becoming someone the city would come to fear. And that was just the beginning. Albert's first steps on the streets of New York felt like stepping into a furnace, the heat of the city burning every bit of softness from him. The streets of the Lower East Side were a blur of people, noise, and the kind of grit that could break a man if he wasn't careful. But Albert was built for this. The poverty, the noise, the endless struggle. It wasn't a curse to him, it was fuel. He didn't come here looking for a handout. He came to make something of himself, something bigger than the small fishing village he had left behind. His early days were marked by the kind of work no one else wanted. He carried crates, scrubbed floors, ran messages for the men who ran things in the neighborhood. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. Albert watched, listened, and learned. He had no choice but to keep his mouth shut and his eyes open. There were others who tried to talk their way into respect, but Albert knew that respect on the streets wasn't earned. With words, it was earned with strength, silence, and a willingness to do whatever needed to be done. That lesson hit home fast. The city wasn't kind to the weak. Those who didn't fit in, those who couldn't move fast enough, got swallowed whole. By his early 20s, Albert had developed a reputation. It wasn't the kind of reputation that was built on charm or social graces. It was built on silence and force. In the city, there were two kinds of people: those who talked and those who didn't. Albert knew which side he wanted to be on. He kept his head down and did his job, whether it was breaking legs for someone who owed money or handling dirty work for the men at the top. His name didn't need to be shouted. It was whispered with a sense of fear and respect. One of his first jobs was simple, an enforcer's job, really teaching a man who had crossed the wrong people what it meant to disrespect the family. The man's body was never found, but the message was clear. That was how Albert worked. He didn't take the time to revel in the bloodshed or the violence. He moved like a shadow, quick and unnoticed, leaving behind a trail of fear. People began to know that Albert Anastasia was someone who could make their problems disappear, but the cost of that solution was steep. In the underworld, where trust was a currency even more valuable than money, Albert's cold demeanor and willingness to do what others hesitated to made him indispensable. It wasn't long before he had worked his way into the inner circles of the most feared families in New York. What started as a rough beginning, scraping by on the streets, was now a foundation for a much darker future. A future where Albert Anastasia would carve his name into the very soul of the city. Albert's first taste of crime was as raw and brutal as the streets he walked on. The city had a way of making men learn quickly, whether they were ready or not. His first real job came in the form of a simple theft, a small-time hustle, something that wouldn't even make the papers. But it was a lesson, one that would set the tone for everything to come. A storekeeper in the neighborhood had been skimming from the wrong people. Word got around fast that he owed money to some very dangerous men, and Albert was given the task of sending him a message. At first, it seemed like just another errand, nothing more than a few broken bones and a warning. But once Albert walked through that door, something clicked. The storekeeper was a scared man, trembling behind the counter, his hands shaking as he tried to protect the cash. The fight wasn't long, just a quick exchange of violence, but it left Albert with a feeling he hadn't expected. He liked the power, the control. It was simple, effective, and it made everything else, the poverty, the struggle, feel distant. For a brief moment, Albert wasn't just another poor immigrant. He was a man with real authority, someone who could take and demand without apology. The money wasn't much, but that wasn't the point. The point was the way people looked at him afterward. The storekeeper cowered in fear, but the men in the shadows? They looked at Albert differently. They saw him not as a boy trying to survive, but as someone who could help them enforce their will on the city. That first job was the beginning of a long line of increasingly dangerous work. Small-time thefts turned into larger jobs, extortion, beatings, and a steady rise through the ranks of the neighborhood. The rules of the street were simple. Trust no one, and prove yourself quickly. Albert knew how to navigate both. He didn't waste time getting to know the other men on the streets. He didn't need to. They knew who he was the moment he walked through the door, and that was enough. He learned the business quickly, how to make money through fear, and how to make people disappear without a trace. Small-time fights became orchestrated assaults, and petty thefts morphed into violent protection rackets that kept the local businesses in check. But it wasn't just the violence that set Albert apart. It was his demeanor. He wasn't flashy, didn't seek attention. He didn't brag or boast. He learned that the more you stayed in the background, the more power you had. As his reputation grew, so did his ambition. He wanted more, not just the scraps from the table, but the entire feast. He wanted respect. The kind of respect that came with knowing you could make anyone bend to your will if you wanted to. Albert wasn't just climbing the ranks of the underworld, he was becoming its backbone. His rise wasn't just about stealing or fighting. It was about making people understand that he could take what he wanted, and when he was done, they wouldn't even know it was missing. That first crime, small as it was the foundation of a man who would come to control not just the streets, but the fear that ruled them. Albert's ascent through the underworld didn't happen overnight. As a young man, he had worked his way through the gritty corners of New York. making his name with each violent act, each job completed with ruthless precision. But it wasn't until he crossed paths with the Italian mafia that his real journey began. It was a world he had seen from the outside, a world that held power, wealth, and influence, things Albert had longed for but never truly understood until he was immersed in it. The Gagliano family was one of the many Italian crime families that controlled swaths of New York City, their fingers in everything from extortion to gambling to bootlegging. They were seasoned, clever, and they knew how to move money, power, and bodies. Albert's introduction to the family came through a meeting with one of its lower-ranking soldiers. He had proven himself on the streets, but the mafia operated on a different level, a higher-stakes game. This wasn't about petty thefts or street fights anymore. This was about loyalty, honor, and making sure that everyone knew who held the cards. The first time Albert met Joe Gagliano, the family's boss, was a moment that would change his life forever. Gagliano was the kind of man who commanded attention without ever raising his voice. He had a presence, an air of authority that made even the toughest men in the room defer to him. Albert, sharp as ever, sized him up immediately. He wasn't intimidated. He wasn't afraid. But he knew that this was the moment that would either make him or break him in the criminal world. Joe took an interest in Albert, recognizing the cold intelligence behind his steely gaze. The old man saw potential in him, potential to do more than just run small jobs. He saw a young man who could rise within the family, who could be molded into something more than just a hired muscle. Over time, Albert became a trusted enforcer for the Gagliano family, quickly earning his place within their ranks. But it wasn't just about doing the dirty work. He learned the art of negotiation, the importance of loyalty, and the silent power that came from controlling not just the streets, but the minds of those who walked them. Albert's mentor was not just Joe, but a few of the other rising stars in the family, men like Carlo Gambino and Vito Genovese. These men were already shaping the future of the mafia, their influence extending beyond New York into the very heart of organized crime in America. Albert watched, absorbed, and learned. He saw firsthand how power was built not just on fear, but on subtlety, on manipulation, on knowing exactly how to bend a situation to your favor. He took it all in, knowing that every lesson he learned from these men was a step closer to becoming one of the bosses himself. The mafia wasn't just a criminal syndicate, it was a brotherhood, a network of men who lived and died by their code. For Albert, this was where he truly belonged. He wasn't just a part of the underworld anymore, he was becoming a cornerstone of it. The Gagliano family wasn't just a stepping stone, it was the platform that would launch him into the halls of power. And Albert, ever the student, was ready to learn whatever it took to rise to the top. Albert's bond with the Gagliano family deepened over time, solidifying his place within the mafia's tightly knit network. He was no longer just a street soldier. He had earned a reputation as someone who could be trusted to handle anything, no matter how dirty. The respect he gained wasn't just because of his strength or his ability to silence a man with a single look. It was because Albert understood the balance of power in a way that few men did. He knew that loyalty in the mafia was as important as blood, and the moment you broke that, you were finished. In the years that followed, Albert's standing within the Gagliano family only grew. His work for the family became more prestigious, and his reputation spread beyond the Lower East Side. The older, wiser members of the crew started to recognize something in Albert, a cold, calculating presence that was unmatched. His ability to remain silent, to do what was asked of him without hesitation, set him apart from the other men in the family. Albert wasn't just part of the crew anymore, he was a pillar of it. And it was through his work and his unwavering loyalty that Albert earned the trust of some of the most dangerous and influential figures in the mafia. Men like Carlo Gambino, Vito Genovese, and even the elusive Lucchese were rising through the ranks of the mafia, and Albert was in the midst of it all. These were the men who would soon be kings, their names spoken in hushed tones in every corner of New York. Albert didn't just observe their rise, he helped fuel it. He learned from them, shadowed their every move, and became indispensable to their operations. The untouchable crew, as they came to be known, was born out of this time. It was a brotherhood formed on mutual respect, ambition, and an understanding that, no matter what, you never betrayed your own. The crew was known for its ruthlessness. They were efficient, deadly, and above all, untouchable. Albert's role in this was clear. He was the enforcer, the one who made sure that the family's orders were carried out without question. When anyone dared cross the Gagliano family, they were reminded of Albert's presence. Whether it was a missing shipment of goods or a betrayal within the ranks, Albert was the first one called upon to make it right. His methods were brutal, swift, and final. He didn't believe in second chances. He believed in delivering a message, loud and clear, that there was no room for weakness or disloyalty. Through his actions, Albert not only solidified his place within the family but also cemented his future as one of the most feared men in the mafia. His bond with the men who would soon rule the underworld was unbreakable. They trusted him not just as a soldier, but as a brother. And as the years passed, it became clear that Albert was no longer just a part of the Gagliano family. He was one of its key architects, shaping the future of organized crime in New York and beyond. Albert's formal induction into the mafia wasn't a grand affair. It wasn't the stuff of movies with lavish ceremonies and dramatic oaths. It was simpler than that, more calculated, like the rest of Albert's life. His initiation into the mob came quietly, behind closed doors, with a handshake and a promise. For Albert, it wasn't just a matter of proving his loyalty. It was a matter of becoming part of something bigger, something that could grant him access to wealth, power, and most importantly, respect. The moment of induction was a brief one. No fanfare, no speeches, just a look exchanged between the men in the room. He wasn't asked to swear an oath in front of a crowd, nor was he required to kiss a ring. Instead, it was understood. Albert was in. The men who sat in that room, men like Carlo Gambino and Vito Genovese, were the kings of the mafia, and Albert was now one of their soldiers. His place was cemented, but there was no time for celebration. The moment you entered the bloodline of the mob, the stakes became real. Your loyalty was tested every day, and Albert knew that his time to prove himself had come. It wasn't long after his induction that Albert was called upon to carry out his first real act of violence as a made man. The task was simple but brutal. Eliminate a rival who had crossed the wrong people. The victim was a man named Frankie, a low-level associate who had been skimming from the family's operations. He was expendable, and Albert was tasked with making sure he paid the price for his betrayal. Albert's first kill wasn't personal. It wasn't about the man. It was about the message it sent. He learned quickly that the mafia didn't just kill for revenge. It killed to maintain order, to remind everyone of the rules. There were no exceptions, no compromises. You broke the code. You paid with your life. The act itself was quick, methodical. Albert didn't hesitate. He didn't think twice. He understood that hesitation could cost him everything. The victim was waiting for Albert in a dark alley, alone and nervous. There was no conversation, no final words. Albert's hands were steady as he did what was necessary. The deed was done quickly, the body left to send a clear message to anyone else who might think about crossing the family. There was no satisfaction in it for Albert, no thrill. There was only the understanding that this was the price of power. This was the reality of his world now. No one crossed the Gagliano family without facing consequences. As Albert walked away, the weight of what he had just done settled in his chest, but it didn't last long. The streets would always demand more, and Albert knew that if he wanted to rise, if he wanted to continue to survive in this world, there would be many more like Frankie. many more decisions to be made, many more lives to take. But this was just the beginning. The family had accepted him, and now they would rely on him to keep things running smoothly, no matter the cost. Albert's reputation as a ruthless enforcer spread quickly through the streets of New York, and with it came the respect that all men in the mafia craved. But respect wasn't given freely. It had to be earned, carved into the flesh of enemies and competitors. Albert didn't shy away from the violence that was demanded of him. He embraced it, became one with it. Every job he took on, every hit he carried out, was a step closer to the respect he needed to rise in the ranks of the mafia. And rise, he did. He had the blood of men on his hands, but he didn't care. In this world, it was either kill or be killed, and Albert knew which side of that equation he wanted to be on. He wasn't just another muscle for the Gagliano family. He became the muscle, the one you called when a problem needed solving, whether it was a debt collection gone wrong, a traitor who needed silencing, or a rival family that had gotten too big for its own good. Albert was the man who made sure things were handled swiftly and without mercy. His approach to violence was cold and calculated, a stark contrast to the chaotic brutality that often marked the underworld. He didn't lose his temper. He didn't let emotions cloud his judgment. When he entered a room to deal with a problem, the air thickened. The others in the room felt the weight of his presence, knew that if they stepped out of line, there would be consequences. But that was the point. Albert wasn't just feared for his strength, though that was undeniable. He was feared because he never hesitated, never showed weakness. He never gave anyone a reason to doubt his loyalty to the family or his ability to carry out his orders. Albert wasn't just a killer, he was a strategist. Every move he made was calculated. He learned the lay of the land, understood who to trust, who to manipulate, and who to eliminate. He played the game with a level of precision that few could match. It wasn't enough to simply follow orders. He needed to make sure that every decision, every action, was in the family's best interest, even if it meant stepping on the necks of those who stood in his way. But as Albert rose through the ranks, it wasn't just power he sought, it was recognition. He wanted everyone to know that he was no longer a shadow in the corner. He was the one in charge, the one who decided who lived and who died. When the family needed someone to send a message, Albert was the man they called. And with each job, his standing grew. His reputation as an enforcer, as a man who could get things done without question, cemented his place in the underworld. In the mafia, there was no room for weakness. Albert understood that better than anyone. To get respect, you had to fight for it, and sometimes that fight was bloody. Albert fought, and he fought hard. With every victory, every clean job, his power and influence inched forward. He wasn't just in the game now, he was the game, and he would stop at nothing to prove it. Albert's first significant murder didn't feel like the pinnacle of his journey. It felt like an inevitable step. Up until then, he had carried out countless jobs, each one more brutal than the last. But none of them had the weight of the man who had just crossed him. This time, it wasn't about proving himself. It was about sending a message, about carving his name in stone for those who thought they could operate outside the rules. The man's name was Joe, a mid-level associate in the family who had begun to develop a reputation for getting too ambitious. He had started to overstep, taking liberties with the family's operations and, worse, talking behind closed doors about his own vision for the future. He saw himself as a leader, not just a soldier, and that was something Albert couldn't let slide. There was no room for upstarts who thought they could play the game with half the skill and half the patience. Joe had to go, and Albert was the one who would do it. The hit wasn't rushed, but it wasn't slow either. The orders came down one afternoon, cold and quick, like a whip cracking in the air. Albert didn't waste time. He knew how the system worked. If you hesitated, if you questioned, it would be you on the chopping block next. He found Joe at a bar in Brooklyn, sitting in a corner booth with a few of his men. There was no confrontation, no shouting, no grand moments of defiance. Albert approached quietly, casually, almost like he belonged there, as if the violence was already decided before he even entered the room. Joe didn't see it coming. One shot to the head, quick and efficient. Albert had learned the art of silence early, never give anyone the chance to fight back. The body fell, and Albert didn't hesitate to leave, blending back into the shadows of the street. He didn't wait for applause. He didn't want recognition. All he needed was the silence that followed, the recognition from those who knew what had happened, even if they never spoke it aloud. In that moment, Albert cemented his place in the family. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a weapon, a man who could be relied on for the toughest jobs. The word spread quickly. No one ever doubted Albert's loyalty to the family, nor his willingness to do whatever was necessary. He was dangerous, and that danger wasn't just about his ability to kill. It was about how he did it efficient, without emotion, like the cold executioner he had become. That first significant kill marked the true beginning of Albert's rise. He wasn't just a player anymore. He was a force, a figure that others had to reckon with, and from that moment on, anyone who crossed him, anyone who stepped out of line, knew that Albert Anastasia would be the last thing they ever saw. Albert's control over the Brooklyn docks was not something that happened overnight. It was a slow, calculated conquest, built on a foundation of fear, loyalty, and cold precision. The docks were one of the most important hubs of the city, where goods from all over the world arrived and departed. Whoever controlled them controlled a significant part of the economy, and Albert understood that better than anyone. It began with small, strategic moves, taking a slice of the profits from those who used the docks for smuggling, squeezing a few truckers who thought they could operate without paying their dues. At first, it was just another stream of income, another way to make money while keeping the Gagliano family's operations running smoothly. But Albert quickly saw the bigger picture. The docks weren't just a place for goods, they were a gateway, a gatekeeper. And if you controlled the gates, you controlled everything. Albert didn't approach this territory with the same subtlety as some of the other families. He made his presence known immediately. The truckers, the stevedores, the businessmen who operated on the docks soon realized that if they wanted to avoid trouble, they had to deal with Albert. He didn't ask for respect, he demanded it. Any resistance was crushed swiftly, with calculated violence that left no room for debate. If someone was slow to pay up or tried to cut a deal behind his back, Albert's men were quick to make it clear that their actions had consequences. A few broken bones, a few smuggled shipments ruined, and the message was received loud and clear. But Albert wasn't just about intimidation. He was a master at negotiation, at making people believe that doing business with him was in their best interest. He wasn't the kind of boss who ruled with a constant fist. He knew when to offer protection, when to let someone off the hook, and when to close in. For the dock workers and those who needed the freight moving, dealing with Albert was a necessity, not a choice. As his grip tightened, so did his reputation. It wasn't long before every major criminal organization in New York recognized the significance of the Brooklyn docks. They began to offer Albert deals, asking for his permission to operate within his territory. What started as a small corner of the mafia's operations grew into something far larger, far more lucrative. He became the go-to man for anything that needed to be moved, whether it was drugs, stolen goods, or even labor. In time, the docks became Albert's domain, and he ruled over them like a king. He wasn't just a part of the crime world anymore, he was a cornerstone of it. His influence reached far beyond Brooklyn, stretching into Manhattan and across the city. No one could move anything without passing through his hands, and anyone who tried to challenge him found themselves on the wrong end of a gun. The docks were his kingdom, and as long as they remained under his control, Albert's power was absolute. His growing influence in the crime world was unstoppable, and those who doubted him soon realized they were mistaken. Albert Anastasia's name spread through the underworld like a shadow that never left. In the beginning, it was just another name among one of many soldiers who did the dirty work for the mafia families. But over time, his reputation began to shift. It wasn't just about getting the job done anymore. It was about the way he did it, and who was left standing when it was over. His kills weren't just murders, they were statements. Each time Albert carried out an execution, he did it with such efficiency and coldness that it became a mark of fear. Those who heard the whispers knew what he was capable of: the swift strike, the deadly accuracy, and most chilling of all, the fact that he took no pleasure in it. His work was done without emotion, without hesitation. He didn't just kill to settle scores, he killed to send a message. The bloodshed wasn't personal, it was business. The mafia respected power, and Albert quickly proved he was not only powerful, but untouchable. He became known as the murder artist because of the precision he brought to each kill. His executions were planned meticulously, with no room for error. It wasn't enough to just kill someone. Albert had to do it in a way that no one could ever question his dominance, his place at the top of the criminal food chain. And soon, word spread beyond the Gagliano family, beyond even the other mafia families. Albert's name became synonymous with terror. By the time his enemies heard he was coming, it was often too late. The men who spoke of Albert did so with fear, not respect. They didn't see him as just a criminal, but as a force, something unstoppable, an entity that could not be reasoned with or negotiated with. In the dark corners of New York, people would cross themselves when his name was mentioned. He wasn't just a killer. He was a reminder that anyone who crossed the line could disappear in an instant, without warning or mercy. For Albert, this fear wasn't something to take lightly. It wasn't just about the power it gave him, or the respect he commanded. It was about survival. The world he lived in demanded loyalty, but it also demanded submission. The higher you rose, the more people wanted to see you fall. He knew that if his reputation ever faltered, if people began to question his strength, it wouldn't be long before someone would rise up to challenge him. That's why he made sure his reputation was not just feared, it was legendary. As his name became more feared, Albert found himself at the center of the criminal world's most dangerous power struggles. His enemies were no longer just other criminals. They were entire families, corrupt politicians, and law enforcement agencies who knew that to take down Albert would mean more than just a fight for power. It would be a fight for survival. And Albert Anastasia, with his reputation for death, knew how to make sure they never stood a chance. Albert Anastasia had never been one to shy away from a job, but when the higher-ups in the mafia began to notice his cold efficiency and unflinching precision, it wasn't long before he was given assignments that carried far more weight than the street-level work he'd started with. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He had become the one they called when they needed someone eliminated, someone important, someone whose death could shift the balance of power. The first major contract he was given was one that would cement his reputation as not just a killer, but a professional, a man who could carry out an execution with such subtlety and finality that no one would be the wiser. The target was a high-ranking figure in another crime family, a man whose treachery had earned him the wrath of the mafia bosses. His death was necessary, but it had to be done with finesse. No mess, no signs of struggle, no trace left behind. It was a clean hit, or nothing at all. Albert approached the job with the same cold calculation he brought to everything else. He spent days, even weeks, studying his target, where he went, who he associated with, and how he moved through the world. It wasn't enough to just know where the target lived or worked. Albert needed to understand the man's rhythm, the flow of his life. And once he had it, he struck quickly and without hesitation. A single bullet, perfectly placed. The job was done, and the world moved on, none the wiser. After that, it became clear that Albert was no longer just the enforcer. He had become the man with the reputation for getting things done. Regardless of the difficulty, the hits began to come in with increasing frequency. Powerful men, politicians, businessmen, those who had crossed the wrong people or simply found themselves on the wrong side of the mafia's interests were eliminated without ceremony. They all knew the price of doing business with men like Albert, but none of them knew the full weight of what that meant until they found themselves staring down the barrel of his gun. For Albert, the contracts were more than just an opportunity to prove himself. They were a way to demonstrate that he was untouchable, a man who could not be swayed, bribed, or manipulated. There were no mistakes in his work, no collateral damage. Every contract was handled with professional care, and every victim was disposed of without a trace. The bodies would disappear, the families would mourn, but Albert's name would never be linked to the crime. It was the perfect execution, the kind of work that left people in awe and terror. As the years went on, his reputation as a contract killer only grew. When the mafia bosses needed someone taken out, someone who mattered, they didn't trust anyone else. Albert was their man, and the more hits he carried out, the more his legend grew until his name was known not just in the mafia circles but in the streets, in the boardrooms, and even in the back rooms of politicians who had begun to fear his professional skill as much as they feared his name. Albert Anastasia was a man of meticulous craft, and the killings he carried out were no exception. To him, murder wasn't just about pulling the trigger. It was an art, a delicate operation that required precision, planning, and a steady hand. He didn't just kill to eliminate an enemy. He killed to make the world believe nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. His reputation as a professional killer wasn't just about the bodies he left behind, but how he left them clean, without trace, and always unpredictable. It was his signature, the way he operated in silence, and the way he made the act of murder seem almost effortless. His hits weren't reckless. They were calculated, almost surgical. A hitman could pull a trigger, but Albert Anastasia made the world believe the death wasn't his doing at all. He learned early on that to be untouchable in the world of organized crime, one had to eliminate not just the target, but any evidence that could tie the hit back to him. There was no thrill in messy work, no glory in the aftermath. The art was in the disappearance of the crime itself. He was known to make his killings look like accidents. Car crashes, drownings, overdoses, anything that could divert suspicion away from the truth. Anastasia understood that the mafia's influence extended beyond the streets. It seeped into police stations, courthouses, and the very veins of the city. So, he was careful, always thinking ahead, making sure that nothing pointed back to him or his crew. He could stage a scene with such precision that even the most seasoned detectives wouldn't question the obvious, focusing instead on the apparent misfortune of it all. For Albert, it wasn't enough to simply make the target dead. He had to make them disappear in such a way that the world would never ask questions. A rival would walk into a building one moment, only to be found days later, slumped over at his desk, a bullet hole placed so perfectly that no one would suspect foul play. Or he'd arrange for someone to fall from a building, the death ruled as a suicide, when in reality, Anastasia had been waiting for the right moment to push. Even in his personal touches, Albert was meticulous. He never left any sort of signature, no message to send. He didn't want people to know he had been there. He didn't need to make a statement, his actions spoke for themselves. He worked in shadows, letting fear grow in silence rather than with loud proclamations. It was this quiet professionalism that made him stand apart from the others. His targets were gone, erased from the world, without a trace of their demise except for the lingering whispers that would follow. In this way, Albert Anastasia built his reputation as one of the most feared men in the mafia, not because of how many men he killed, but because of how perfectly he did it, how he made death seem like just another natural event in a world already full of them. His work was an unspoken symphony, where each hit played a note of calculated precision and cold finality, and when he left, there was nothing left to find, nothing to connect him to the scene. It was simply done. Albert Anastasia had risen through the ranks of the mafia not just by strength and loyalty, but by proving himself capable of executing the most delicate tasks that required not just muscle, but the kind of cold calculation only few men could master. The higher echelons of the mafia had noticed him early on, and soon enough, he found himself enmeshed in a world where murder wasn't just a tool for survival, but a business. And in this business, Albert became one of the most sought-after hitmen in the criminal underworld. It wasn't that the mafia needed just anyone to carry out their dirty work. They needed a man who could handle the most difficult, the most high-profile murders, those that, if done wrong, could bring down entire empires. These weren't petty hits on small-time crooks or rivals. These were contracts on men who mattered: politicians, businessmen, and sometimes even other mobsters who had outlived their usefulness. For those jobs, only the best could be trusted, and Albert had quickly proven himself as the go-to man for these delicate operations. He was a master at making sure his jobs were carried out without a hitch, using connections and resources within the underworld that no one else had access to. When someone needed to be removed, Anastasia was the one they called. And these were jobs that came with a different weight, the type that didn't just require physical brutality, but the art of orchestrating the perfect crime. His reputation for never leaving a trace, for making even the most visible deaths look like accidents or natural causes, made him invaluable to those who held the power. As Anastasia grew in stature, so too did the stakes of the contracts he took on. These weren't just personal vendettas or revenge hits, they were strategic moves within the larger mafia power structure. Sometimes, the contracts came directly from the family bosses, but just as often, they were commissioned by other powerful figures in the criminal world, all of whom trusted Albert to carry out the task without hesitation or failure. His name alone was enough to strike fear in the hearts of those who knew him. The man who had once been a small-time enforcer had now become a highly paid professional, handling jobs that required not just skill, but discretion. The business of murder for hire wasn't just about killing, it was about knowing how to cover up the crime, about making sure no one traced the job back to the client, and most importantly, it was about creating a legacy. In the mafia, the men who could be relied on for such crucial tasks were considered indispensable. Anastasia wasn't just another soldier in the army. He had become the go-to man for the most dangerous jobs, and his name would live on long after the blood had dried. For Albert, murder had become more than just a means of control, it had become a career. As the years passed, the whispers surrounding Albert Anastasia's name began to take on a life of their own. He was no longer just a man who carried out hits. He had become an almost mythical figure in the underworld, a shadow that loomed over the streets of New York. People didn't speak his name in the open, not out of respect, but because the mere mention of him seemed to carry a weight that pressed on their chests. His brutality was not just feared, it was revered. The city trembled in the silence he left behind, as much as it did in the violence he executed. It wasn't the sheer number of murders that built his legend, it was the coldness, the methodical precision, and the seemingly endless creativity he brought to each job. The stories varied, of course. Some claimed he would kill without warning, his targets never knowing their fate until it was too late. Others told of a man who could make his victims disappear, their deaths never traced back to him, leaving behind only a faint trace of fear that lingered in the air long after the body was gone. What unified these stories was the feeling of inevitability that came with Anastasia. To cross him wasn't to risk death, it was to ensure it. In the dim corners of taverns, in the back rooms of restaurants, and in the depths of the criminal community, his name spread like wildfire. Each story added another layer to his myth, feeding the fires of his growing reputation. People didn't ask for details. They didn't need to. They knew that to cross him was to sign their own death warrant. And yet, there was something fascinating about him too, something that made the stories seem almost like folklore, passed down from one generation of criminals to the next. Even those who didn't know the man personally knew of his presence. It wasn't just the word of mouth that spread his name, it was the undeniable effect his actions had on the criminal world. A man who could cut down anyone in his path, from the highest crime bosses to the smallest informant, and do so with a calculated, almost artistic touch. He became a symbol of fear and respect, and soon his reputation wasn't just limited to New York's underworld. Word traveled across the country, from Chicago to Los Angeles, wherever the mafia had its reach. In his wake, a trail of broken men and shattered lives remained. But more than that, there was a silence that followed him. Not just the quiet after a murder, but the kind of silence that made people second-guess their every word and movement. The name Albert Anastasia was no longer just a name, it was a warning. It was a promise of death to those who dared challenge the power he wielded. And for every legend told about him, another was born, further cementing the place of his name in the dark corners of the world where fear and power reigned supreme. There were those who thought they could challenge Albert Anastasia, those who believed his power was fleeting or simply too terrifying to last. They were wrong, and many paid the price for their miscalculations. In the ruthless world of the mafia, there were few things more dangerous than underestimating a man like Anastasia. Those who thought themselves strong enough to oppose him quickly learned that his brutal efficiency in dealing with enemies was unrivaled. One such man, a rival mobster who had risen through the ranks in Brooklyn, decided he could topple Anastasia's influence. He believed that Anastasia's reputation was based on fear alone, and thought that with enough backing and the right connections, he could wrest control of the territory the King of the Docks had carved out for himself. His mistake was not understanding the depth of Anastasia's reach, or the precision with which he eliminated threats. The plot began small. The rival made a series of quiet alliances, promising his supporters wealth and power in exchange for taking Anastasia down. For a time, it seemed like he might succeed. But as the whispers of betrayal grew louder, so did the inevitable shift in power. Anastasia, always a step ahead, caught wind of the conspiracy before it fully took shape. He didn't act immediately, knowing the value in letting his enemies think they were winning. He allowed them to become comfortable in their false sense of security. When the time came, Anastasia struck swiftly and with deadly purpose. In one night, his enemies were dismantled, their plans rendered moot by a series of swift and unforgiving executions. The rival who had once dared to challenge him was found in the street, lifeless and with a look of confusion frozen on his face, as though he had never fully grasped the consequences of opposing such a force. His men scattered, their spirits broken by the unrelenting brutality they had failed to anticipate. For them, it was a reminder that Anastasia was not just feared for his actions, but revered for his ability to make opposition vanish without a trace. Anastasia's reputation wasn't just about his ability to kill, it was about the inevitability of his response. In the criminal world, where alliances shifted like sand, Anastasia had made it clear that no one could rise against him without swift retribution. The bloodshed wasn't just an act of power, it was a message. The message wasn't lost on others in the underworld. There was no one who dared move against Anastasia without considering the blood it would cost. And in every corner of New York, from the quietest alley to the busiest docks, men who had once thought of themselves as untouchable now quivered under the weight of his name. The enemy's fear became the air everyone breathed, silent, omnipresent, and suffocating. Albert Anastasia's world was one governed by loyalty, but loyalty in the mafia was always fragile, a thin thread that could snap with the slightest provocation. His relationship with his peers was a constant dance of power, respect, and suspicion. While Anastasia held a commanding presence, he never fully trusted anyone, not even those who served him faithfully. The very nature of his work required that he rely on others, but each bond was a gamble, each handshake a calculated risk. For the most part, his underworld colleagues respected him, and his reputation alone was enough to keep most men in line. But even in the mafia, where betrayal often led to violent ends, not all alliances could weather the storm of time. There were moments when Anastasia's trust was tested in ways that left lasting scars. The most painful of these betrayals came from the very men he had brought into his inner circle, men he had once considered brothers. One such betrayal came from a trusted lieutenant, a man who had served Anastasia for years, executing hits and handling dirty work with ruthless efficiency. This man, however, grew restless, tired of being in Anastasia's shadow. He began making moves behind his boss's back, aligning himself with rival families, secretly undermining Anastasia's operations. The whispers about his growing disloyalty started to trickle through the ranks, and Anastasia, ever vigilant, took note. When he finally confronted his lieutenant, the man denied any wrongdoing, swearing his loyalty to Anastasia. But the damage had already been done, and Anastasia knew that once trust had been broken, it could never truly be repaired. Anastasia didn't waste time with half measures. In the mafia, betrayal was a death sentence. The lieutenant was given no chance to plead, no opportunity to escape. He was executed in a way that sent a clear message to anyone watching. There was no tolerance for treason in Anastasia's world. The body was left in plain sight, a stark reminder that even the most trusted would not be spared if they crossed him. But betrayal wasn't always so overt. Sometimes, it came in subtle forms. It could be a quiet whisper in a back room, a misplaced word that stirred the pot, or a promise broken in the shadows. When such betrayals occurred, Anastasia was even more unforgiving. He'd eliminate the threat swiftly, with calculated precision, making sure no one would ever dare question his authority again. His power was built not just on his ability to kill, but on his ruthless handling of those who thought they could play him for a fool. In the end, Anastasia's world was a delicate balance of trust and suspicion, loyalty and betrayal. He knew that to survive, he had to be both feared and respected, but most importantly, he had to remain untouchable, a figure whose word was law. His ruthless handling of betrayal ensured that his empire would stand firm, at least for a while longer. Albert Anastasia, for all his brutality and iron grip over his criminal empire, was a man deeply rooted in the values of loyalty and family, at least when it suited him. The Mafia Code was a powerful force in his life, shaping his every move, but it was a code often tested by the harsh reality of his world. For Anastasia, loyalty wasn't just a word, it was a currency, one he expected in return for the brutal protection he offered. Yet, as much as he lived by the Mafia's unwritten rules, there were moments when the weight of personal beliefs about crime and honor crept into his decisions. In the beginning, loyalty was a straightforward matter. It was about respect and power. If you served Anastasia, you obeyed him, followed orders, and did as he commanded, without question. That was the code, and it was as unbreakable as the steel doors of a vault. Yet, as his power grew and his empire expanded, Anastasia was faced with the uncomfortable truth that sometimes family, his true family, would conflict with the cold, hard demands of the underworld. Anastasia's personal relationships, especially with his own brothers, were complicated. While he was ruthless and demanding in his dealings with peers, there was an underlying thread of obligation to his bloodline that occasionally tied him down in ways the Mafia Code didn't allow for. He knew that loyalty to family was a sacred part of the code, but the line between family and business was often a blurry one. Anastasia's need for control didn't make it easy for him to let his brothers operate without interference. and sometimes this clash led to tension, even resentment. The friction grew when his brothers were involved in situations that didn't align with the mafia's interests. Anastasia, for all his success in climbing to the top of the criminal world, still had to balance personal bonds with the harsh reality of mafia dealings. The demands of loyalty sometimes came with a price he wasn't always willing to pay, especially when it conflicted with the cold, strategic decisions that governed his empire. But Anastasia's beliefs were not so easily swayed by family ties alone. When business needed to be done, whether it involved betraying close associates or even eliminating people he once considered close, Anastasia would act without hesitation. The mafia code called for loyalty, but it also demanded that the family remain untouchable, an untouchability that sometimes required eliminating those closest to him, even if they were family. Ultimately, Anastasia's view on the mafia code was simple. Loyalty was only as strong as the service it provided. If a person wasn't useful anymore, if their loyalty could no longer be counted on, it was no longer about blood or family. In his world, survival and power came first. And so, while the mafia code held great weight, Anastasia never allowed it to blind him to the necessity of doing whatever it took to maintain his position at the top. Family ties were important, but they were no match for the code of the street, the one he'd sworn to live and die by. Albert Anastasia's reign as one of the most feared figures in the mafia was not just built on power or influence, but on blood, the blood of those who had wronged him, betrayed him, or simply stood in his way. The murders that defined his career were not always the cleanest, nor the most calculated, but they were always a message. Each death, whether swift or drawn out, sent a signal to anyone watching. Anastasia was untouchable. He was a man whose loyalty was bought with fear, and whose power was maintained with violence. The first of these key murders was the killing of Joe the Boss, Masseria, a turning point in the bloody war for control over New York's 5 families. Masseria had been a major figure in the Genovese family, but his rule was marked by a crippling amount of arrogance. He made enemies of not just his rivals but his own people, and Anastasia, then still an enforcer, was one of the men chosen to carry out the hit. The murder was carried out with surgical precision. Masseria was gunned down while dining in a restaurant, the moment when his empire crumbled. It wasn't just a political maneuver. It was a statement that Anastasia was someone to be feared, someone whose ambition could only be checked by the finality of death. Then there was the murder of Salvatore Maranzano, another monumental figure in the mafia world, whose death solidified Anastasia's position as a power player. Maranzano had declared himself the boss of all bosses, a title that Anastasia could never accept. His murder was orchestrated by none other than Charles "Lucky" Luciano, but Anastasia's hand was deep in the plot. When Maranzano was killed, it was clear that the old guard was being replaced by a new generation of leaders. Anastasia, already known for his brutality, was now cementing his reputation not just as an enforcer, but as a man capable of orchestrating the very murders that changed the course of mafia history. Anastasia's rise was also marked by the killing of those who had once been his allies. There were whispers that Anastasia had been responsible for the death of his former mentor, the Gagliano family boss, for reasons only known to those involved. While the murder was never fully confirmed, the timing of Gagliano's death was too coincidental to ignore. In this world, betrayal could not be tolerated, even if it came from someone you once considered a friend. Anastasia had no room for weakness, no tolerance for those who couldn't keep up with his demands. The final key murder that defined Anastasia's reign was his involvement in the infamous killing of his rival, Vito Genovese. Genovese had once been a close associate, but Anastasia's rapid ascent created friction, and ultimately, the murder of Genovese became a matter of necessity. It was a quiet execution, the kind that left no room for escape. With Genovese gone, Anastasia's grip on power was complete. His fearsome reputation as a murderer and a leader solidified for good. Each of these murders painted a vivid picture of the man Albert Anastasia was becoming, a figure who played by his own rules and whose ultimate loyalty was to the mafia, not to sentiment or familial bonds. His reign was not simply one of fear but of calculated and deliberate violence, making sure that those who opposed him would never rise again. Albert Anastasia's power was not confined to the streets or the dark corners of Brooklyn. It reached far beyond, into the corridors of power where deals were made with a handshake and a promise of silence. As his reputation grew, so did his influence, and soon he wasn't just a feared mob enforcer. He was a kingmaker, pulling strings behind the scenes, using his wealth and deadly reputation to secure allies in the most unlikely of places within the political establishment and law enforcement itself. Anastasia understood early on that in order to maintain his hold on power, he needed more than just muscle. He needed protection, and that came in the form of politicians and cops who were willing to turn a blind eye or take a bribe. The streets were important, but so were the men in suits who made decisions in the state houses, the courthouses, and the back rooms of New York's finest clubs, in the 1940s and 50s. As the mafia's grip on the city tightened, Anastasia began to make powerful friends. He didn't do it the way others might, by merely bribing or threatening. No, he understood the subtleties of influence. He made connections with local politicians, offering them money in exchange for favors, votes, influence, and most importantly, protection from the law. His ties to New York's political elite were well known in the underworld, and soon he had more than a handful of city officials in his pocket. They kept their distance when it came to the dirty work, but when Anastasia needed something, they didn't hesitate to act. He also found himself deeply entwined with corrupt law enforcement officers, men who wore the badge but took orders from men like Anastasia. He used his wealth to create a system of favors, some subtle, others more direct. Cops would turn a blind eye to illegal activities, let shipments go through customs unchecked, or make sure that evidence against him never made it to a courtroom. With their help, Anastasia could operate with impunity, knowing that no matter what happened, the right people would be there to make sure he wasn't touched. But his influence grew so powerful that by the 1950s, he was considered untouchable, even by the authorities. He wasn't just a mob boss, he was the man who could make or break careers. The political system and law enforcement were as much a part of his empire as the docks and the streets. Anastasia didn't just control the mob, he controlled the city, manipulating its politics and law enforcement to serve his needs. But in the end, it was this very political influence that would come back to haunt him. With so much power in his grasp, Anastasia made enemies not just in the underworld, but within the government itself. Those who had once turned a blind eye began to see him as a threat, and when the winds of change began to blow, they turned on him with a vengeance. But in the years he reigned, Albert Anastasia had proven one undeniable truth. In the world of organized crime, power wasn't just earned, it was built from the foundations of politics and law. Albert Anastasia's name became synonymous with fear long before he even entered a room. As the years wore on, the line between the man and the myth started to dissolve. What was once a terrifying figure of the mafia's underworld slowly began to transform into something far larger, more than a criminal, more than a killer. He became a force of nature, a legend whose very presence seemed to chill the air. The brutality he exhibited on the streets, the cold efficiency with which he carried out murders, and the unrelenting fear he instilled in his enemies blurred the line between the real Albert Anastasia and the mythical figure that the public came to fear and respect. As his body count rose, so too did his reputation. He was no longer simply a mob enforcer or even a feared hitman. He became something far more dangerous. Stories about him spread like wildfire, whispered in the shadows of every street corner and dark alley. People began to speak of him with a mix of reverence and dread. The man who could kill without blinking, whose wrath was swift and merciless, was now becoming a myth, a force that seemed unstoppable. His murders weren't just acts of violence, they were performances, orchestrated with a cold precision that left an indelible mark on anyone who crossed him. The mythology surrounding Anastasia began to grow, fueled by the very fear he instilled in his enemies. Those who spoke of him didn't just speak of the man, they spoke of a monster, a beast whose rage had no limits. The stories told of men who had tried to oppose him, only to meet bloody ends. People began to see him less as a man and more as a symbol of death itself. He wasn't just a criminal. He was the embodiment of fear, an unstoppable force that destroyed everything in its path. But the line between the man and the myth began to blur even more as Anastasia's actions became more audacious. He reveled in the power his reputation gave him, knowing that the more brutal and ruthless he became, the more untouchable he appeared. His reach extended further than the criminal world, and his very name was enough to silence opposition. The fear of his name was almost as powerful as his actual presence. People were paralyzed by the thought of what he might do to them, whether they had crossed him or not. With each passing day, Albert Anastasia became less of a man and more of a monster in the eyes of the public. The stories of his killings took on a larger-than-life quality, turning him into an almost mythical figure. He wasn't just a mobster anymore. He was the thing that nightmares were made of. The fear of his name had grown so intense that it became his greatest weapon. And as the myth of Albert Anastasia grew, so did his power. He was no longer just feared, he was immortalized in the very streets he had once ruled, forever etched into the dark history of the Mafia. As Albert Anastasia's power in the Mafia world expanded, so did the tensions that simmered just beneath the surface. He was no longer just a trusted enforcer or a deadly hitman. He had become a player in a much larger game, one that saw him increasingly at odds with other powerful families in New York. The Genovese family, led by Vito Genovese, became one of his most formidable rivals. Their aspirations clashed with Anastasia's, particularly as his influence over the waterfront and the labor unions became more pronounced. Anastasia's rise to prominence wasn't without its complications. The Genovese family, ever strategic and calculating, had long held power in Manhattan and were not keen on sharing control of the city's most lucrative enterprises. Anastasia, who had his sights set on expanding his reach, found himself on a collision course with them. His control over the Brooklyn docks and his connections with labor unions made him an asset to the Gambino family, but it also put him in direct competition with the Genovese interests. The dock workers, the unions, the shipping routes, they all became pawns in a dangerous game of chess where each move could have dire consequences. The tension between Anastasia and the Genovese family escalated slowly at first, with subtle jabs and veiled threats exchanged behind closed doors. But as their competing interests grew more pronounced, the situation became more volatile. Anastasia's growing influence over the docks and his involvement in the union's dealings put him on a direct collision course with Genovese's ambitions. The docks were a critical source of revenue for both families, and neither was willing to back down from what they believed was rightfully theirs. The final straw came when Anastasia began to push for more control, refusing to share the spoils with anyone. His audacity and brutal methods only made the situation more volatile. His enemies in the Genovese family, led by the calculating Vito, saw his power grab as a direct threat to their own. In the cold, cutthroat world of the Mafia, there was no room for compromise. With tensions at a breaking point, it was only a matter of time before the confrontation became inevitable. Anastasia, ever the tactician, knew that war was coming. He wasn't blind to the rising threat posed by the Genovese family and their allies, but he was resolute in his belief that he had earned his place at the top. The battle for control of New York's underworld would be a bloody one, with every alliance and betrayal shifting like sand beneath their feet. Anastasia, the man whose name had become synonymous with violence, was now fighting to maintain his empire against a family that was just as ruthless, if not more so. The line between victory and defeat was razor thin, and every decision he made could be his last. The battle for control had begun, and Anastasia would fight until his final breath to secure his throne. Albert Anastasia had long known that to maintain his dominance in the underworld, he would need to remove those who stood in his way. The rivalries in the mafia were never settled through diplomacy or negotiation. They were handled with bloodshed and ruthlessness. It was no different when it came to the murder of Frank Costello, the powerful head of the Genovese crime family, whose influence was beginning to overshadow Anastasia's own. Costello had made a critical mistake by underestimating the lengths Anastasia was willing to go to ensure his grip on power. Costello was more of a strategist than a brute, a man who had built his empire through cunning alliances and political connections rather than direct violence. He was the kind of boss who preferred to sit behind a desk, pulling the strings from the shadows. But Anastasia had no patience for such subtlety. His philosophy was clear: those who didn't respect the mafia code, those who refused to bow to his will, had to be eradicated. The longer Costello remained in power, the more he posed a threat to Anastasia's plans. And so, Anastasia decided that the time had come to eliminate him. But it wouldn't be an easy task. Costello had his own allies, his own supporters within the mafia. To kill a don like him required careful planning and, most importantly, the element of surprise. Anastasia wasted no time setting his plan into motion. His men were everywhere, watching, waiting for the right moment. The details were precise, the execution flawless. On the day of the killing, Costello had been leaving his Manhattan apartment, completely unaware that the very men who had once served him were now set to betray him. The hit was carried out with chilling efficiency, a testament to Anastasia's growing influence over his territory. Frank Costello was shot in the back of the head, a clean, methodical kill that sent a clear message to anyone who doubted Anastasia's power. The murder of Costello wasn't just about eliminating a rival. It was about sending a statement to everyone who still thought they could challenge him. Anastasia wasn't just a hitman anymore. He wasn't just a man who carried out orders. He was a boss, a kingmaker, a figure capable of eliminating anyone who stood between him and ultimate control. Costello's death opened the door for Anastasia to consolidate power, not just within the Gambino family, but across the entire city. The killing of the Don was a turning point. It marked the moment when Anastasia was no longer a mere enforcer. He was a king in the making, sitting atop the heap of the mafia world, ruling with an iron fist. The blood spilled that day was more than just a single life taken. It was a declaration that the man who once served as a shadow in the criminal world was now its uncontested ruler. As Albert Anastasia rose to power, he made many enemies, but few felt the sting of betrayal more than those he had once considered loyal. Among his inner circle was a man named Joseph "Joe" Gallo, a rising star in the world of organized crime. Joe was brash, ambitious, and, at one time, a trusted ally of Anastasia's. Together, they had fought to solidify control over key territories, shared in the spoils of the underworld, and made plans for the future of their families. But in the cutthroat world of the mafia, trust was always a fragile thing, and ambition had a way of eroding even the most solid alliances. Gallo's betrayal did not come overnight. It started with whispers, small rumors of discontent that seemed harmless at first. But as time went on, those whispers turned into something more dangerous. Gallo began to plot in the shadows, talking to Anastasia's rivals, testing the waters for a potential power grab. He was ambitious, too ambitious for his own good, and as he rose within the ranks of the family, he grew restless under Anastasia's iron rule. He believed he could do better, that he could lead with a more modern approach. It was this belief that ultimately led to his downfall. The betrayal itself was cold and calculated. Gallo tried to undermine Anastasia by turning his own men against him, promising them power and influence if they sided with him. He painted Anastasia as a relic of the past, a tyrant who ruled through fear, while Gallo presented himself as a man of the future, a leader who could usher in a new era of prosperity. He knew that Anastasia's reputation for brutality was both his strength and his weakness. Gallo banked on the fact that the growing dissatisfaction with Anastasia's iron rule could be turned into a full-fledged rebellion. But Anastasia was not blind to the danger. His instincts told him something was wrong, and soon enough, the betrayal came into full view. He moved quickly, as he always did, using his contacts and his vast network to uncover Gallo's treachery. The plan was set. Gallo had overestimated his power, underestimated Anastasia's ability to act swiftly. In one fell swoop, he was cut off from his allies, isolated from those who had once pledged their loyalty. The cold betrayal ended, with Gallo's blood spilled on the cold, hard concrete of the streets. Anastasia made sure to send a message there could be no room for disloyalty in his world. Trust had to be absolute, and any challenge to his reign would be met with swift retribution. Gallo's death served as a reminder to everyone in the underworld. Betrayal was not only unforgivable, it was deadly. The last war that Albert Anastasia fought was a battle that would ultimately define his reign, and, in many ways, his downfall. By the time the conflict erupted, Anastasia had built an empire of fear, his grip on the underworld unshakable. However, as with any throne, there were always those who sought to take it for themselves. The Genovese family, among others, had been eyeing his territory for years. Their power was growing, and their ambition was as unyielding as his own. At the heart of the war was a struggle for control over the most lucrative territories, the docks, the gambling houses, and the street rackets. The mafia was evolving, becoming more corporate in its dealings. Anastasia's iron-fisted rule was a relic in a new world of politicking and silent deals. His enemies knew that to take him down, they couldn't rely on brute force alone. They needed to break his influence, dismantle his network, and weaken his support within his own family. The fight was vicious, but Anastasia was no stranger to bloodshed. His strategy was always one of overwhelming force, striking with precision when the moment was right. He had been through battles before, both physical and political, and his experience made him more dangerous than any of his enemies. Anastasia knew the streets, the players, and the weaknesses of those who sought to challenge him. His reputation preceded him, and yet his enemies believed that they could outsmart him. The war that unfolded was brutal. The streets of Brooklyn ran red, the bodies piling up on both sides. But it wasn't just the street-level killings that made the war so intense, it was the quiet, calculated moves made in the shadows. Allies were bought and sold, loyalty was tested, and the war spread far beyond the streets. The Genovese family made a calculated move to isolate Anastasia, attempting to force his allies into submission with promises of power and wealth. But Anastasia's network was far-reaching, and he had his own set of informants planted among his enemies. The turning point came when Anastasia outwitted his rivals with a brilliant strategic move. He feigned weakness, allowing his enemies to believe they had the upper hand, but in doing so, he set a trap that would leave his rivals vulnerable. He attacked their supply lines, dismantling their operations one by one, and cut off their financial backing. When the Genovese thought they had him cornered, Anastasia struck with devastating precision. The final blow came not in the form of a gunshot, but through the collapse of his enemies' networks. With his rivals in disarray and their power shattered, Anastasia emerged victorious. But while he had won the war, it would be the scars left behind on his body, his mind, and his reputation that would haunt him in the final days of his life. Albert Anastasia's reputation was built on violence, brutality, that seemed almost clinical in its execution. His hands were stained with the blood of dozens, if not more, of those who dared cross him or his family. His kill list was as long as it was brutal, each murder carried out with a cold calculation that made him one of the most feared men in the underworld. The concept of mercy was foreign to him, and his approach to the art of killing had become a disturbing combination of method and madness. Anastasia's mind worked like a machine when it came to murder. There were no emotional attachments, no fleeting impulses. Each death was an equation, one he had memorized through years of experience. He knew the exact moment when to strike, the precise way to deliver the fatal blow. His methods were often ruthless, leaving no trace, no connection to the crime. He was known for making his killings look like accidents, pushing bodies into the depths of rivers or slipping them into the shadows of the night. Some murders became legendary, not just for the violence involved, but for the sheer coldness with which he executed them. There was the time he orchestrated the murder of a former ally, a man who had once been one of his closest confidants. Anastasia had given him a place at the table, but as was often the case, betrayal was too heavy a burden for loyalty to bear. The hit was swift and quiet, a gunshot in the night, and by morning, the betrayal had been erased. No trace remained but a corpse in a forgotten alley. The man had simply disappeared, as if he had never existed. The most chilling aspect of Anastasia's killing spree was the way he viewed the murders. For him, they were a job no different than any other task he carried out for the family. The bloodshed was simply part of the business, a necessary evil. His mind compartmentalized the acts, stripping them of any emotional weight. He didn't feel sorrow for the men he killed. He didn't even feel anger. It was as though he had been born to be the executioner, a role he filled with an almost robotic efficiency. This indifference to death became his calling card. It was what set him apart from the rest of the mafia. He wasn't just a mobster, he was the heartless hitman who could make death look easy, making the rest of his enemies shudder in fear of the inevitability of his arrival. To Anastasia, death wasn't personal. It was just business, and he was the best at it. Albert Anastasia's strength was never just in his ability to kill, it was in his subtle manipulation of the forces around him. While his reputation for brutality was enough to strike fear into the hearts of his enemies, it was his calculated, behind-the-scenes moves that truly solidified his place in the mafia's power structure. He wasn't simply a figure of terror, he was a master strategist, always pulling the strings from the shadows. His control over the streets wasn't built through loud confrontations or obvious displays of power. Instead, it was his quiet, precise maneuvering that kept the enemies at bay. He knew the value of maintaining alliances and cutting them when necessary, understanding that loyalty in the criminal world was more often bought than earned. He kept a web of informants close, men in law enforcement, businessmen, and even within the political machine. These relationships allowed him to anticipate moves before they were made, and in turn, he struck with devastating efficiency. Rivals often underestimated his capacity for patience, assuming that they would see his hand before it was too late. They didn't realize how adept he was at working through intermediaries, controlling events through proxies so that his own involvement was never directly connected. Anastasia would never get his hands dirty if he didn't have to. He could orchestrate a hit from a distance, letting others carry out the final bloody work, all the while keeping his own name untarnished by the grime of the streets. The art of manipulation extended beyond mere physical violence. It was about controlling perception. He understood the value of reputation in the criminal world, how a man's name could become an impenetrable shield. The myth of Anastasia grew with every whispered story of his ruthlessness, but few realized the calculating mind that lay beneath the brutal exterior. He created an image of himself as an untouchable enforcer, but he was so much more than that. He played the long game, ensuring that anyone who dared challenge him would be eliminated not only in body but in influence as well. And so, with each passing day, Anastasia tightened his grip on New York's criminal empire. He eliminated rivals with precision, not just by killing them, but by undermining their power at the roots. He was the shadow behind the throne, controlling the chaos of the streets while remaining untouchable. His enemies often didn't even realize they had been outmaneuvered until it was too late. By the time they realized their downfall was inevitable, Anastasia had already vanished into the shadows, watching their rise and fall from a distance, ready to take advantage of their mistakes. Albert Anastasia's name was whispered in both awe and fear, his every move carefully documented by the press. While the criminal world knew him as a ruthless enforcer and power player, the media had a different role to play in shaping his legacy. Newspapers, eager for sensational stories, captured the ferocity of his actions, creating an image of Anastasia as both a villain and a figure of intrigue. His crimes became headlines. His brutality spun into tales that fed the public's need for drama. The man behind the myth was less important than the myth itself, a product that the media polished and presented with all the darkness and fascination of a true underworld king. In the streets of New York, Anastasia was a legend, but outside the criminal world, he was something else. He became a symbol of the city's grit, its criminal underbelly laid bare in headlines that both repelled and attracted readers. The press painted a picture of a man so powerful that even the law seemed unable to touch him. But there was a nuance to the public's perception. While they feared him, they also revered the very aspects of him that terrified them. The media played its part, turning Anastasia into a larger-than-life figure, a cautionary tale wrapped in mystery. His actions were undeniable, and the public couldn't help but follow his every move. His involvement in some of the most notorious hits, his ability to evade law enforcement, and his cold demeanor were all fuel for the media's insatiable hunger for scandal. Yet, amidst the terror, there was a strange respect. In some circles, he was admired for his toughness, his ability to rise from the streets and claim a seat at the table of the city's most powerful. To the public, he wasn't just a criminal, he was a force of nature, a man who operated with a code of his own and answered to no one. In the minds of the public, Anastasia was a paradox, both feared and admired, hated yet celebrated. The press made sure that his reputation, tainted with violence, was also adorned with the intrigue that comes with being untouchable. This complex relationship between his criminal acts and the media's portrayal of him ensured that his legend would endure long after his reign. To the people, he was the living embodiment of the city's darkest secrets, the man who made power and fear work in tandem, building a legacy that thrived in the shadows of the press and public alike. As Albert Anastasia's reign stretched on, the harshness of his world began to weigh heavily on him. He had long been known for his icy resolve, his ability to execute cold-blooded orders without hesitation, but with age came an unsettling awareness of the toll his life had taken. He had spent years in the shadows, watching friends and enemies alike fall, all while climbing higher and higher in the criminal world. But now, as time passed, the brutal clarity of his actions began to seep into his consciousness. The life of a killer was not one that easily allowed for reflection, but Anastasia's mind could not help but wander back to the early days, when survival meant fighting tooth and nail to claim his place. Those were simpler times, when every decision was about power, respect, and survival, not the toll on his own soul. But now, as he sat in the quiet moments between deals and meetings, the reality of his choices began to haunt him. How many men had he sent to their graves with no more thought than a flick of his wrist? How many families had been torn apart by his decisions, victims of his ambition? Anastasia found himself reflecting on the cost of his work, the endless string of lives lost at his command. There was no denying the power he had amassed, nor the fear he had instilled in others. But somewhere deep within, he began to question whether it had all been worth it. He had always believed in the mafia code: loyalty, strength, silence, but the constant violence and manipulation began to erode his certainty. Was it too late for redemption? Did he even want redemption? The truth was, he had no answers, only more questions that lingered in the silence of the night. His actions had made him a god in the underworld, but the price of that power had taken something from him. He was not the same man who had risen from the streets with nothing. The hunger for more, the drive for control, had consumed him, and now he was left with a gnawing emptiness. He wondered if he could ever return to a life where he wasn't constantly looking over his shoulder, wondering if today would be the day someone finally came for him. But for all his internal turmoil, Anastasia knew one thing: he had made his bed, and it was far too late to change the sheets. The world he had built was a house of cards, and now, as the years pressed on, he was trapped in it. The enforcer's dilemma was a quiet war within, where the man who once ruled with an iron fist now wrestled with the ghosts of the past. The emotional toll was not one that could be seen on his face, but it was there, festering just beneath the surface, a silent weight that bore down on him as the shadows grew longer. As Albert Anastasia's power grew, so too did the number of those who sought to dethrone him. The mafia world is never one to rest on its laurels for long, and when someone rises as high as Anastasia, the eyes of rivals begin to watch, waiting for the slightest misstep. He had made enemies within the 5 families, but as his influence stretched further, his reach seemed to touch every corner of the underworld. It was as though the very power he had built became a beacon, drawing the attention of those who wanted to claim a piece of it for themselves. The Genovese family, once his allies, started to look more like adversaries as their interests collided. Vincent the Chin Gigante, a rival with his own ambitions, watched Anastasia's every move with a calculating eye. Beneath the surface, the Genovese were positioning themselves to take a larger role in the city's organized crime. To them, Anastasia represented an obstacle, a symbol of brute force and bloodshed that had earned him power but left him with few true allies. The other families, the Gambinos, the Lucases, and the Colombo, were not much different. As his influence expanded, his grip on the docks, on labor unions, and on the streets made him both a necessary partner and a dangerous rival. Even those who once admired his ruthlessness began to fear his growing ambition, realizing that Anastasia's reach was beginning to exceed his grasp, and they could become nothing more than pawns in his ruthless climb to the top. But it wasn't just the mafia families that resented Anastasia. Law enforcement and politicians, who had long turned a blind eye to his actions when it suited them, were beginning to grow weary of the chaos he sowed. His name was synonymous with violence, and as his power solidified, it became impossible to ignore the bloody trail he left in his wake. He had never been one to care for the law, but the consequences of his continued violence were becoming harder to ignore. Even the government, which had once been content to let him operate within certain bounds, was no longer willing to turn a blind eye. The growing number of enemies around him began to weigh on his every decision. Anastasia had lived his life surrounded by fear, but now that fear was reflected back at him. Every gesture, every word, every meeting carried the weight of possible betrayal. The streets, once his kingdom, now seemed more like a battlefield. Every handshake was calculated, every alliance fragile. Trust had always been a rare commodity, but now it felt as though it had become an extinct one. The man who had once ruled with certainty and dominance now found himself battling not just his rivals, but the very nature of the world he had built. The higher he climbed, the more enemies he seemed to create, and in the end, he couldn't help but wonder if it was all worth it. Albert Anastasia had spent years building his empire on a foundation of fear, ruthlessness, and calculated violence. But as with all kings, the higher they rise, the harder they fall. The first cracks in Anastasia's reign began to appear slowly, at first just whispers in the shadows. His dominance over the docks, the unions, and the streets had been absolute. But the constant bloodshed and betrayal were beginning to take their toll. His enemies were no longer just plotting from behind closed doors, they were actively working against him, and the whispers were beginning to grow louder. Anastasia's grip on power had always been maintained through terror. He had earned the title of the murder artist for a reason. His methodical and cold-blooded approach to eliminating anyone who dared to stand in his way had worked for years. But as his power grew, so did his vulnerability. His violent ways had made him a target, not only for rival mafia families but also for those within his own ranks who were tired of living in fear of his wrath. The tension with the Genovese family was escalating, with Vincent, the Chin, Gigante, becoming more vocal in his ambition. The Gambinos, under the leadership of Carlo Gambino, had begun to make their own moves to consolidate power. These families had long been competitors, but Anastasia's unchecked aggression had made him a liability. As he continued to eliminate his rivals with calculated precision, his enemies started to form alliances. The stakes grew higher, and the delicate balance of power was beginning to tip in dangerous directions. Anastasia was no longer the untouchable force he once was. The law, once a distant concern, had started to close in on him. His name was now a fixture in the headlines, as the media began to report on his exploits with a sense of inevitability. His reign had brought an air of inevitability to every corner of New York. But now, that same sense of inevitability seemed to surround his downfall. He had made enemies, many of them powerful, and as the noose tightened, the once unshakable confidence that had propelled him to the top began to wane. The final blow came in the form of a betrayal from within his own family. Those who had once sworn loyalty to him now saw him as an obstacle. Anastasia had built his empire on a bed of lies and fear, and those same tactics that had served him well for so long were beginning to unravel. He had become a liability to the very men who had once been his closest allies. The same men who had taken orders from him without question now saw his ambition as a threat, and they moved to take what was his. In the end, it wasn't the law that would be his undoing. It wasn't even his rivals. It was the simple fact that when a king becomes too tyrannical, even his most loyal subjects will turn on him. The man who had once seemed unstoppable was now being pulled into a downward spiral that would end in his brutal and inevitable fall from grace. The world around Albert Anastasia was changing, and not in ways that favored him. The mafia, once a domain where strength, brutality, and loyalty determined success, was starting to evolve. The old ways, the code of silence, the tight-knit bonds forged by bloodshed and loyalty were being tested by a new breed of mafia men. Men who saw the power in discretion, in smooth-talking business deals, and in playing the political game rather than relying solely on intimidation and force. The sharp edge that had once made Anastasia so feared was now a liability in a world that was shifting beneath him. The younger generation of mafia figures, many of them trained by the likes of Carlo Gambino and others from the Genovese family, had begun to see organized crime through a different lens. It wasn't enough to simply terrorize the streets anymore. There was money to be made in legitimate businesses, in corrupt politics, and in clean, quiet control. The brutal approach that had worked so well for Anastasia no longer held the same sway in a world where secrecy, manipulation, and influence were just as valuable as a bullet in the back. Anastasia, in his relentless pursuit of power, had refused to change. He had always been a man of action, a man who made his reputation by spilling blood and eliminating anyone who dared to challenge him. He had built his empire by force, but the new generation was beginning to realize that you didn't need to spill blood to control power. They understood that you could keep your hands clean while still pulling the strings. Anastasia, however, could not or would not adapt. His heavy-handed tactics alienated those around him, even his closest allies. The men who had once fought alongside him began to see him as an outdated relic of the past. The mafia had always thrived on loyalty, but loyalty had its limits. The world around Anastasia was evolving, and his way of doing business was becoming less effective by the day. His enemies, too, began to sense the shift. They no longer needed to outgun him or outfight him, they simply needed to outsmart him. The walls were closing in. Those who had once looked up to Anastasia as a king in the underworld were now quietly distancing themselves, realizing that the price of loyalty to a man like him was too high. He had reached the apex of his power, but the world had moved on. In a mafia that was becoming more sophisticated, more organized, and less reliant on bloodshed, Anastasia's brutal reign seemed increasingly out of place. He could no longer keep up with the shifting tides of a changing underworld. The rules had changed, and he was no longer able or willing to adapt. And in the end, that would be his greatest downfall. As the years passed, Albert Anastasia's empire began to crumble from within. The men who had once sworn loyalty to him now found themselves questioning that very allegiance. The underworld, always a treacherous place, was beginning to feel more like a house of cards, teetering on the edge of collapse. It wasn't the bullets or the blood that would take him down, but the quiet whispers of betrayal, the shift in loyalty that had once been his greatest weapon. A key figure in Anastasia's circle was his trusted lieutenant, a man who had climbed the ranks alongside him and had been integral to his rise. But as the mafia world around them began to change, so did his perspective. He had once stood by Anastasia, fearing no rival, respecting the ruthlessness that had kept their enemies at bay. But with the rising tides of power struggles within the mafia, this lieutenant started to see things differently. He became disillusioned with Anastasia's heavy-handed rule, and began to grow resentful of the very violence that had propelled them both to power. The once unshakable bond between them began to fray, and the whispers of discontent turned into conversations in the dark corners of the city. This disillusionment didn't just stop with one man. As the tension in the underworld grew, more and more of Anastasia's inner circle began to question their loyalties. It was an unspoken truth that the more powerful someone became, the more enemies they amassed. Anastasia, though feared by many, had a growing list of enemies within his own ranks. Old allies who had once shared his vision now saw him as a relic of a violent past, a man who was no longer capable of leading the charge into the future. They saw opportunity in aligning with other rising powers, in changing sides while the stakes were still high. Betrayal in the mafia world was not just expected, it was inevitable. These men who had once stood beside Anastasia in the heat of battle, men who had bled and killed for him, now found themselves planning his downfall. They knew too much, had seen too much, and in a world where loyalty was currency, they knew that the cost of staying loyal to a man on the decline was too high. They turned their backs on the man who had built their fortunes and their reputations, quietly feeding information to rivals and making deals with the enemy. The backstabbing, the secret meetings, the whispered promises, each betrayal set the stage for Anastasia's ultimate demise. What was once a tight-knit group of trusted men was now a fractured alliance, each turncoat calculating their own survival. The machine that had once been unstoppable was now slowly being dismantled from the inside. With each piece that fell away, Anastasia's empire weakened, and the man who had once ruled with iron fists was now being undone by the very loyalty that had gotten him to the top. In the end, it would be the turncoats who, with quiet treachery, would seal his fate. Albert Anastasia had always prided himself on his ability to outthink, outfight, and outlast his enemies. For years, he had carved a path to the top, slaughtering those who stood in his way with ruthless precision. But as his reign grew more uncontested, the cracks began to show within the very system he had built. His closest allies, men who once owed him everything, now looked at him with growing suspicion, contempt, and, in some cases, outright hostility. Anastasia had become the very thing he had once destroyed. A king whose throne was vulnerable. A ruler who could no longer command unwavering loyalty. The situation came to a head when Anastasia's long-standing partnerships with the other mafia bosses, those who had helped him seize control of the Brooklyn docks and the lucrative rackets of the city, began to unravel. In the quietest of meetings, in the darkest corners of the city, whispers of a challenge to his power grew louder. These were not outside forces. No, these were men he had called allies. Men who had once sat at his table, shared the spoils of their bloody victories, and swore loyalty to him above all else. But in the harsh light of the changing mafia landscape, loyalty had grown thin, and ambitions had bloomed in the shadow of his dominance. One by one, his fellow bosses began to move against him, each driven by a desire to seize control of the turf and wealth Anastasia had so carefully amassed. The Gallianos, the Genovese, and even the Lucchese families all saw an opportunity to diminish Anastasia's power and claim a piece of the empire that had once seemed invincible. For a man who had murdered countless rivals, the thought that his own brothers in crime would now turn their weapons against him felt almost unreal. But it was happening, and Anastasia knew it was only a matter of time before the inevitable confrontation would come. It started with subtle moves, backroom deals, shifts in alliances, the quiet murmurings of men who once called Anastasia their protector, now turning away from him, but it quickly escalated into something more violent, more personal. The showdown with the bosses was not going to be a polite exchange of words. It was going to be a bloody battle for survival, a ruthless fight to determine who would rule the streets of New York. Anastasia, ever the tactician, knew that he could not let this challenge go unanswered. His reputation, his very power, depended on it. But in the face of mounting betrayal, his response was just as deadly as the threat. He called upon his closest loyalists and set the stage for a confrontation that would leave bodies in its wake. The once unbreakable bond between the mafia families was shattered, and Anastasia was now fighting for his life, his empire, and everything he had built. The result was inevitable, and as always, the blood would flow. Albert Anastasia had always known the game was one of power, loyalty, and, above all, control. In the underworld, money could buy almost anything, and influence could change the course of any battle. But even for a man who had spent years carving out his empire through violence, there were still certain walls built from the power of the government that needed to be breached. Anastasia, ever the strategist, had long understood that if he were to keep his grip on power, he needed the right connections in the right places. And when a high-ranking government official became the target of his ambition, he made the fateful decision to bribe his way to the top. The plan was simple, as most things in Anastasia's world were. He knew the man, an influential figure with the power to affect everything, from police investigations to city contracts. This official had the ability to make Anastasia's world easier to navigate, removing the constant threat of law enforcement breathing down his neck. In exchange for the man's cooperation, Anastasia had promised a substantial amount of money, along with the usual perks that came with such an arrangement: a life of luxury, discretion, and a steady flow of income through the mob's various businesses. At first, it seemed like the perfect deal. Anastasia had made similar arrangements before, greasing the right palms to avoid conflict with the law. He had done it with judges, police officers, and politicians, always making sure his bribes stayed below the radar. This time, however, the stakes were higher. The official was a bigger fish, and the risks involved were more than Anastasia had anticipated. But arrogance and confidence had always fueled his every move, and he convinced himself that this, too, would go off without a hitch. But as it often happens in the treacherous world of crime, things did not go as planned. The bribe was accepted, but not without drawing unwanted attention. Word of the transaction began to leak, slowly at first, like a crack in a dam. It was an oversight, a small misstep that Anastasia didn't see coming. In his rush to solidify his influence, he had underestimated the very thing that had always made him successful: caution. The bribe, which had seemed like a simple, calculated move, had now become the spark for a dangerous chain reaction. Law enforcement began to take notice. Investigations were quietly opened, and whispers of corruption started to spread through the corridors of power. The mob had been under the radar for years, but this time, Anastasia's carelessness had drawn too much attention. The bribe that had been meant to keep him untouchable had instead placed a target on his back. In the end, it was a miscalculation, a costly one that would set off a series of events beyond Anastasia's control. It was the first crack in his empire, one that would eventually widen, threatening to consume everything he had fought so hard to build. Albert Anastasia had always prided himself on his ability to sniff out disloyalty. For years, he had relied on a network of trusted men, those who had proven their loyalty time and time again to keep his empire running smoothly. But even in the underworld, where loyalty was currency, no one was immune to the reach of law enforcement. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly, a whisper here, a glance there. But before long, it became clear that Anastasia's tightly knit operation had become a breeding ground for betrayal. The first signs were subtle. A member of his crew, someone who had been with him for years, began acting strangely. He was suddenly more cautious, looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone to be watching. Then came the whispers, low, hushed conversations that didn't quite add up. Anastasia had always been vigilant about maintaining the loyalty of his men, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Little did he know, those whispers were the first cracks in his foundation. As the weeks passed, it became undeniable. Informants were slipping into his ranks, their loyalties twisted by fear, money, or promises of leniency. The government had gotten smarter, and their agents were better at infiltrating organizations like Anastasia's. They didn't need to go after the top men anymore. They had learned to work their way into the lower levels of the operation, quietly pulling strings and feeding information to authorities. It was a well-executed plan, a rat's nest of informants, each with their own part to play, each feeding information to the enemy, slowly dismantling the empire he had worked so hard to build. It didn't take long before the cracks became fissures. The raids began, one after another, with each one hitting closer to home. Anastasia's men were being arrested at an alarming rate. Some of them turned quickly, offering up information in exchange for lighter sentences. The trust that had once held his world together was eroding, and with it, Anastasia's grip on power. He had always controlled his territory through fear and respect, but now, his own men were undermining him from within. Anastasia, ever the pragmatist, knew he had to act fast. He had always prided himself on being able to eliminate threats before they could get too close. But this time, the enemy was within his own ranks. There was no way to escape the weight of the betrayal. He could feel it like a shadow following him wherever he went. The rats had burrowed too deep, and no matter how many heads he chopped off, the nest kept growing. The realization struck with a cold, harsh clarity. His organization was no longer his own. It had been infiltrated, corrupted, and was crumbling under the weight of the very betrayal he had always feared. What was once a formidable empire was now a house of cards, teetering on the brink of collapse. It was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down around him. Albert Anastasia had always been at the center of the storm. For years, his name had been synonymous with power, control, and fear. But lately, something had shifted, subtle at first, like the slow erosion of a cliff face by the constant pounding of the ocean. He could feel it in his bones. The once unshakable grip he had on the underworld was loosening, and with it, the suffocating loneliness of his position began to set in. He had always surrounded himself with loyal men, but loyalty was a fragile thing. something that could be shattered in an instant by the right amount of pressure. He had built his empire on the backs of those who feared him, but fear alone wasn't enough to hold a kingdom together. As his power grew, so did the enemies he had made. The walls around him that had once been sturdy now seemed to close in on him, each betrayal a fresh wound, each loss a reminder that he was no longer the untouchable force he had once been. Anastasia could feel the cold weight of isolation creeping in. The voices that had once rallied behind him now spoke in hushed tones, their allegiance wavering, uncertain. The phone calls he once took with ease now felt like a chore. The meetings that used to be full of confidence and control now tinged with uncertainty. Even those who remained loyal to him could sense the cracks in the foundation, and that, more than anything, was what gnawed at him. The fear that had once kept everyone in line had begun to fade, replaced by something much more dangerous: doubt. He could see it in the faces of the men who still sat around the table with him, their eyes darting nervously, their words carefully chosen. They were afraid, yes, but not of him now. They feared what his downfall might bring. They feared the vultures circling, waiting for their chance to swoop in. They feared the inevitable chaos that would come when his empire crumbled, and they feared being caught in the crossfire of a war they no longer knew how to win. Anastasia had always been a man who thrived in the chaos of the streets, who reveled in the violence and bloodshed that came with the life he had chosen. But now, as the weight of his own empire began to crush him, he realized something: no matter how many men he silenced, no matter how many enemies he eliminated, it was never enough. The price of power was too high, and in the end, it was the loneliness that consumed him. Even the walls of his luxurious homes felt like prisons, each room a reminder that he was no longer the man he once was. The power he had built, the empire he had fought for, was slipping through his fingers, and no matter how hard he tried to hold on, he couldn't stop the inevitable. The world that Albert Anastasia had built was slowly crumbling, piece by piece, and it wasn't the outsiders who were taking it from him. No, it was the ones closest to him, the ones who had shared in his rise to power, the men who had once sworn undying loyalty. As the months went by, Anastasia began to notice the subtle signs that something was wrong. It wasn't obvious at first, a few missed meetings here, a few whispers there, but the tension in the air became palpable, and the realization started to settle in like a cold fog. There were snakes in his midst. It wasn't just the usual power struggles from rival families or the constant threats from the authorities. It was something far more insidious, something that hit at the very core of who he was. The loyalty he had relied on for so long seemed to be evaporating. One by one, his closest men began to act strangely. The sharp nods, the deferential glances, had turned into something else: hesitation. They were careful in their words, guarded in their actions, and the lack of respect, though subtle, was impossible to ignore. Anastasia wasn't a man who easily overlooked signs of weakness. He had been in this game long enough to know when someone was trying to pull away. But even he wasn't prepared for the full scope of the betrayal that was unfolding before him. It wasn't just a few underlings stepping out of line, it was the people he trusted most. Men who had fought at his side, who had bled with him, were now plotting his downfall. The realization struck him like a bullet, sharp and cold. They had been feeding information to rivals, taking payments from enemies, and making deals behind his back. The sense of betrayal was suffocating. Anastasia had built his empire on fear, on respect, and most importantly, on loyalty. Loyalty had been the cornerstone of his reign, and now it was turning to dust. The same men who had sworn to protect him were now conspiring to destroy everything he had worked for. The horror of it wasn't just in the treachery, it was in the fact that he hadn't seen it coming. For a man who prided himself on his ability to read people, to control every situation, this was his greatest failure. The walls that had once kept enemies at bay were now filled with cracks, and the termites of betrayal were eating away at the foundation. He had trusted these men like brothers, had given them everything, and now, in return, they were preparing to take it all from him. The anger that bubbled up inside him was almost too much to contain, but there was no time for blind fury. He needed to act, to tighten his grip before the traitors could rip it all away. But as the days passed, it became clear there was no fixing it. The betrayal had already been set in motion, and Anastasia, no matter how ruthless, would find it harder and harder to stop the inevitable. His empire was no longer safe, and those closest to him were the ones who would bring it down. As the days wore on, Albert Anastasia felt the grip he had once held so firmly on his empire to start to slip through his fingers like sand. The city that had once bowed before him, feared his name, now seemed indifferent to his power. The whispers grew louder in the shadows, betrayal, lies, and cracks in the foundation he had spent so many years building. What had once been a tightly woven network of loyal men and allies was now a patchwork of distrust and division. His very strength, the thing that had made him a feared and respected figure, was now his greatest weakness. In the cold of the nights, when he lay awake in the stillness, Anastasia could hear the ticking of time, each second a reminder of his inevitable downfall. It wasn't just his enemies in other families who threatened him now, it was the men he had once called brothers, the men who knew his every move, every secret, and who had once swore loyalty to him. Those same men were now maneuvering behind his back, building alliances with his rivals, preparing to take his throne. His mind raced, the old calm confidence slipping away as the walls closed in. He had always prided himself on his ability to control every situation, every person in his life, but now, even his own inner circle was turning against him. There were too many whispers, too many secrets, and far too many unknowns. With every passing day, it became more clear that he was losing his grip. The empire he had worked so hard to build was beginning to crumble, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Desperation set in. Anastasia tried to tighten his grip, calling in favors, offering incentives to old allies, and cracking down on anyone who showed signs of disloyalty. But the efforts felt hollow. He was no longer the untouchable force he once was. Men no longer trembled at the sound of his name. Even those who had once revered him seemed to avoid eye contact, their faces increasingly blank, their loyalty now a distant memory. He threw himself into his work, trying to regain control by focusing on the small battles, ensuring the shipments ran smoothly, eliminating the occasional threat. But even those efforts felt futile. Every victory seemed hollow, a mere distraction from the inevitable fall that loomed over him like a dark cloud. The fear that had once been his currency was no longer enough to protect him. It wasn't just the law that was closing in anymore, it was the betrayal of those who had sworn to protect him. As he sat in his office, the weight of his empire on his shoulders, he felt the loneliness creep in. His empire, his legacy, was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His once unshakable resolve wavered. In the quiet moments, he knew the end was near. He had fought for power, for control, but in the end, it was the very thing he built that would destroy him, and there was no escaping it. In the final days of Albert Anastasia's reign, there was a palpable tension that hung in the air, thick and suffocating. He had lived a life built on fear, intimidation, and calculated violence, but now it was fear that gripped him. The once powerful enforcer, the man whose name had been whispered with terror in dark corners of the city, found himself in the unrelenting grip of his own paranoia. Every knock on the door, every passing shadow, seemed like a prelude to his downfall. He knew it was coming. The end was inevitable. The streets he had once ruled so effortlessly now seemed foreign, as though the world had shifted beneath his feet. His old allies, the men who had sworn loyalty to him with blood, now moved in silence, their eyes filled with cold detachment. The The loyalty that had once bound them to him had long since frayed, replaced by the stench of betrayal. Every gesture, every word seemed to hold double meaning. He couldn't trust anyone anymore, not even those who had shared in his most violent triumphs. The men who had helped him climb to the top were now the same ones plotting to push him down. In the rare moments when he was alone, when the noise of the city was distant and muffled, Anastasia would sit in the dim light of his apartment, staring out the window. His thoughts raced, but they were not the same ones that had driven him forward in his earlier years. Now, his mind was clouded by doubt. The fear that had once made him a king in the underworld now clawed at him from within. He had always been able to control everything, to impose his will on the world around him, but now he could feel it slipping away like sand through his fingers. Every phone call, every conversation was a potential threat. The safe houses that had once been his refuge were no longer enough to shield him. He could no longer tell friend from foe. The men who had carried out his orders with unflinching loyalty were now hesitant, uncertain. The line between his allies and his enemies had become impossible to distinguish. Even in the comfort of his own home, there was a gnawing sense of dread, an awareness that he was no longer the predator, but the prey. The paranoia that had once been a tool, an instinct honed through years of ruthless survival, now consumed him. He no longer trusted the silence, no longer found comfort in the stillness. His every movement was calculated, measured. He would no longer take unnecessary risks, no longer allow himself to be vulnerable. Yet, no matter how much he tried to control the situation, the inevitability of his fall weighed on him like an anchor, dragging him closer to the end. There would be no grand final confrontation, no dramatic last stand. The man who had killed with impunity, who had made a living out of terror, would be taken by his own fear. In his final days, Anastasia was not a king of the underworld, but a man trapped in his own legacy, awaiting the inevitable end. And he knew, deep down, that there was no escape this time. In the final, brittle moments of Albert Anastasia's life, the walls around him had already begun to close in. His empire, built on decades of bloodshed and fear, was crumbling. His former allies, now more like vultures circling a dying beast, could sense his vulnerability. His paranoia had become a part of his existence, a constant companion, but it couldn't shield him from what was coming. The city that had once obeyed him now whispered of his inevitable fall, and the men who had once feared his wrath now saw his death as nothing more than a matter of timing. Anastasia had been careful, though, as careful as a man could be when every shadow felt like an enemy. He avoided his usual haunts, sought refuge in ever more hidden corners of the city. Yet even in this self-imposed isolation, the clock was ticking. His enemies knew that it was only a matter of time before he made a mistake, and when it came, it would be the last one. The final move against him was a well-executed orchestration, as calculated as any of his own murders. His enemies had watched him, studied his habits. They knew he would take the bait. It was a simple setup, a meeting in a barber shop, a place where he had once felt safe, surrounded by the routine of a neighborhood salon. It was almost too perfect, too familiar. Anastasia, so used to being the one pulling the strings, never suspected that his confidence had left him blind. He walked into the barber's chair as though it were just another day, just another errand. He trusted his instincts, his streetwise intuition, which had always guided him in the past. But in that moment, there was no one to protect him from the threat that had been closing in for weeks. The hitmen, silent and precise, had already positioned themselves. They didn't need to rush, didn't need to shout or fire in a panic. They waited, as calm as the executioners they were. As the razor blade sliced through the air, the first shot rang out, puncturing the quiet. Anastasia's eyes widened, but it was too late. His gun was nowhere near, his reflexes too slow. Before he could even rise from the chair, the second shot found its mark. His body slumped, the final traces of power draining from him as quickly as the blood from his wounds. The third shot finished the job, sealing his fate. No one rushed in, no grand stand, no heroic last moments. There were no witnesses to tell the tale. Anastasia had been caught in the very trap he had set for so many others. The men who had once feared him now had no fear at all. He had been outsmarted, overpowered by those who understood the same game he had played his whole life. As he lay there, in the barber's chair, the truth became clear. Even the deadliest men eventually meet their end. For Anastasia, it had come not with a roar, but in a whisper, a subtle shift in the shadows that had always danced around him. And this time, the darkness took him. Albert Anastasia's murder sent shockwaves through the underworld, reverberating through the streets of New York like a thunderclap that no one had been prepared for. The man who had once been the embodiment of the mafia's brutal power, feared by all, respected by few, was no longer a threat. His lifeless body, slumped in a barber's chair, became a grim symbol of the violent world he had ruled. But for all the blood he had spilled, his death was just another piece in the ruthless puzzle of organized crime. The reaction from the mafia was one of calculated silence at first. The men who had plotted and executed his assassination had learned well from the lessons of Anastasia's own bloody reign. They understood the value of keeping things quiet, not drawing attention to themselves. After all, Anastasia had made a name for himself by eliminating rivals with the same cold efficiency that he had once employed. The rule had always been clear. If you wanted to survive in this world, you didn't make noise when you killed. But the implications of his death were far-reaching. The shockwaves quickly spread beyond the confines of the mafia, rattling those in positions of power who had once looked the other way when Anastasia's name was mentioned. His murder was an open challenge to the mafia's very heart, a symbol of vulnerability where there had once been invulnerability. It was a moment when the underworld seemed to turn on itself. The response from the other crime families was swift, but not without tension. The Genovese family, who had been Anastasia's longtime rival, had their own interests to protect. They wasted no time in filling the vacuum left by his death, but they also knew better than to be seen as the perpetrators. It wasn't just about gaining power, it was about maintaining the fragile balance that had kept the mafia running for decades. They didn't want to be seen as taking control by force. The other families knew that any hint of disorder could draw the attention of the law and expose them all. They moved swiftly, silently, but with the unmistakable knowledge that the game had shifted. Anastasia's death was also a reflection of a deeper, more disturbing shift in the underworld, a change that the mafia could no longer ignore. The old rules were being broken, and men like him, who had risen by blood and fear, were being replaced by men who operated with more finesse. Power, in the wake of his death, no longer rested solely on the ability to inflict fear. It was also about influence, connections, and the ability to stay one step ahead of the law. In the streets, the reaction was more visceral. To some, Anastasia was a hero, the kind of man who had kept order in the chaos of the city. To others, he was a monster, a brutal enforcer who had left nothing but carnage in his wake. His death had created a void, and that void would eventually be filled. But whether the next man who rose to take his place would follow in his footsteps or burn the bridges that he had built remained to be seen. Albert Anastasia's burial was an event wrapped in the kind of silence that his life had never known. It wasn't grand or public. No large crowds gathered to mourn the man who had been the embodiment of mafia power for so long. Instead, his final moments were marked by quiet steps in a cemetery far from the eyes of those who had once feared him, or even revered him. It was a stark contrast to the life he had led. The man who had commanded attention, whose mere presence could bring death or fortune, was now just another body laid to rest beneath the earth, lost among the thousands who had come before him. His funeral was private. Only those closest to him were there to witness his passing. Men who had been a part of his reign, his rise, and his brutal climb to the top. But even they knew that the end was inevitable. This wasn't the kind of death that brought any glory. It was simply the final step in a long, bloody dance with destiny. The cemetery was quiet, its stillness almost suffocating, as if even nature itself was reluctant to speak of what had come to pass. There were no grand gestures, no flowers thrown by the masses, no last-minute speeches about the man's legacy. His life, lived by the sword and marked by violence, ended with a quiet dignity that no one had expected. The men who had followed him in life were now forced to walk in the shadows, keeping their heads low, knowing that the power they had once shared with him was fading. In a way, his death was as empty as the tomb he was placed in, a final resting place that would never see the kind of fanfare a life like his might have warranted. The world didn't stop for Albert Anastasia, it merely moved on. The news had already begun to fade from the front pages, and the whispers of his reign began to sound more like ancient history. His enemies, the ones who had plotted and schemed to bring him down, were left to enjoy their victory in the quiet after the storm. But for those who had known him, there was an eerie sense of finality in his burial. The man who had held power with an iron fist, the one who had never flinched when faced with an enemy, was now nothing more than a name etched into stone. His power, his fearsome reputation, seemed so distant now, like a ghost that had already slipped from their memories. His grave was a simple one, no greater than any other. In the end, Anastasia's life, marked by violence, deceit, and murder, was reduced to nothing more than an inscription, a brief chapter in the ever-turning pages of history. It was fitting, in its own way, that his death, so marked by his enemies and the lives he had taken, would be just as silent as the man who had once ruled in a symphony of bloodshed. The quiet end was the last chapter in the story of Albert Anastasia, a man who had built an empire on fear, only to be buried without the applause or recognition he once commanded. The death of Albert Anastasia left a void that reverberated through the underworld. The man who had held dominion over the docks, enforced the mafia's will with ruthless precision, and made even the most powerful men tremble, was gone. With his absence came a power vacuum that created an opportunity, one that others were quick to seize. The mafia, ever evolving, shifted its focus. Leaders emerged from the shadows, figures who saw a chance to step into the place once filled by Anastasia's indomitable presence. The void didn't last long. Men who had quietly waited in the wings, watching Anastasia's rise and fall, now moved swiftly, calculating their ascension. The streets buzzed with the rumors of who would take his place. The older heads, those who had shared in his power, had their own designs, but there was no denying the new blood that was rising up in the ranks. Men like John Gotti, with his sharp mind and ambitious streak, began to stir the waters. He was different from Anastasia, more polished, more charismatic, yet no less dangerous. In the world of the mafia, style mattered, and Gotti's blend of ruthless ambition with charm made him a compelling alternative to the cold, violent enforcer that had once been the face of the Gambino family. Gotti's rise wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable. He knew the landscape well, knew who to trust and who to silence. He made alliances with those who could help him and removed those who could not. The story of Anastasia's fall had been a cautionary tale, and Gotti, along with other emerging figures, understood that to survive in this world, one had to adapt. They had learned from Anastasia's mistakes and were careful not to repeat them. It wasn't just Gotti, though. Several factions within the Gambino family began to position themselves, jockeying for power, aligning themselves with the right people, and most importantly, taking care to remain untouchable by the law. The rise of these figures marked a shift from the brutal, direct reign of Anastasia to a more subtle, calculated approach. While the streets had once been ruled by force and fear, Now they began to see the power of influence, media manipulation, and public relations. The game was changing, and those who could adapt were the ones who would thrive. The mafia was evolving, and with Anastasia's death, the old ways of doing business were dying off. The new breed of mafia bosses would still carry the bloodstains of their predecessors, but they would do so with a different strategy in mind. As the world of organized crime shifted, it was clear that the vacuum left by Anastasia had been filled, but not by one man alone. It was a new era, one in which power would no longer be measured by who could kill the quickest, but by who could outlast, outwit, and manipulate the system. Albert Anastasia's death rippled through the underworld, but its effects on his family were far more personal and profound. His wife, who had spent years cloaked in the shadows of his violent world, found herself thrust into a life she had never truly wanted. The constant fear of losing her husband, the quiet tension that had existed for so long, was now replaced by a reality that she couldn't escape. With his death, she became an unwilling widow, living in the aftershocks of his actions, now forced to face the consequences alone. His children, young and impressionable, were left with a legacy far too heavy for their shoulders. The world that had once been filled with privilege and hidden power now felt like a trap, one that neither they nor their mother could truly escape. They grew up in the shadow of his name, a name that had once been feared and respected, now tainted by the blood that had flowed so freely during his reign. The stories of his brutality, the killings, the fear, and the violence were things they would hear about in whispers. They were left to navigate a world where their father's actions were both a source of pride and a reason for fear. The impact on his children was subtle but deep. They were not just marked by his legacy, but by the stares they received from strangers who knew their name, who knew what their father had done and what it had cost them. As they grew older, they came to understand the weight of it all. They couldn't outrun their father's past, no matter how much they tried to live their lives on their own terms. There was no escaping the specter of Albert Anastasia, the stories, the legends, the fear. His children, despite their attempts to lead normal lives, often found themselves caught in the crossfire of his legacy, dragged back into the world he had created, whether they wanted it or not. The impact of his death wasn't just felt in the streets, in the mafia, or within the criminal circles. It was felt at the dinner table, in the quiet moments between family members who had been scarred by years of living in his shadow. For his wife, the loss of Albert was a loss of the life she had built around him. For his children, it was a loss of identity caught between the desire to escape the life he had created for them and the undeniable truth that they could never fully outrun it. Their father's name had ensured that they would be watched, judged, and remembered forever. The repercussions of his death weren't just about the violence he left behind. They were about the lives he had changed, shattered, and left to pick up the pieces. After Albert Anastasia's death, the public's perception of him became as fractured as his legacy. For many, his name was synonymous with terror, an embodiment of the brutal, unrelenting mafia figure who struck fear into the hearts of anyone who crossed him. To those who had suffered from the bloodshed he left in his wake, Anastasia was a monster. The tales of his ruthless killings and the chilling efficiency with which he dispatched his enemies made it impossible to see anything else but the cold, heartless enforcer he had been. He was the man who brought violence into every corner of New York, and his name became a warning not just to rivals, but to anyone who dared to defy the criminal world. Yet, for others, the story of Anastasia was far more complicated. Among the families in the lower rungs of society who had benefited from his brand of justice, there were whispers of gratitude, even reverence. His involvement in charity work, his contributions to building schools, and his philanthropic gestures toward the impoverished neighborhoods of Brooklyn painted a more nuanced picture. These acts did not erase his many crimes, but they allowed some to see a man who wasn't just a killer, but a figure who had made his own community feel seen, valued, and protected in a world that often ignored them. To these people, Anastasia was a tragic figure, a product of the system, a man who had been molded by the same violence he perpetuated. To the media, Anastasia's death was a spectacle. His murder became the stuff of headlines, dissected and sensationalized in a way that further blurred the line between man and myth. Journalists painted him as both villain and martyr, feeding the public's insatiable appetite for stories of power, blood, and betrayal. The contradictions were easy to exploit. On one hand, he was a feared kingpin who had dominated the mafia for years. On the other, he was a tragic soul, a man who had spent his life surrounded by death, never able to escape the violence that had defined him. As the years passed, his myth began to take on a life of its own. The more his name appeared in books, films, and documentaries, the further removed the real man became from the public eye. Anastasia was no longer just a killer or a criminal. He became a symbol of the underworld's power, a symbol of the cost of ambition, and a symbol of how easily a man can be consumed by the world he seeks to control. People would still speak of him in hushed tones, in bars and on street corners, but the true Albert Anastasia had long since slipped into legend. To the public, he was a paradox, a monster to some, a tragic hero to others, and in the end, perhaps that was the most fitting legacy of all. After his death, Albert Anastasia's name slowly evolved into something much larger than the man who had lived it. The harsh reality of his life, filled with bloodshed and betrayal, began to fade into the shadows as stories and myths took root in popular culture and criminal lore. His reputation grew, not through the deeds he committed, but through the stories that grew around him. Stories that seemed to be passed down, embroidered with each retelling. The truth of his violence was magnified, warped into something more monstrous, and yet, strangely, more compelling. In the streets, among those who still remembered the terror he had inspired, Anastasia became a symbol. His name was whispered in hushed conversations, often used as a warning. He was no longer just a man. He had become the embodiment of the criminal empire he had ruled. He was the enforcer, the untouchable kingpin, whose word was law, and whose power was absolute. He became, in the eyes of some, the archetype of mafia violence, a figure who lived outside the constraints of the law, whose word alone carried weight, whose decisions could shape lives and end them just as quickly. The myth-making around Anastasia didn't stop at the street level. In the world of organized crime, his name took on a life of its own. Younger generations of criminals, who had never seen his face or witnessed his rise to power, still spoke of him with reverence. To them, Anastasia was more than a man. He was a legend, a figure they strived to emulate. His brutal efficiency, his cold approach to business, and his fearlessness in the face of betrayal became a template for what it meant to be a successful mobster. But it was more than just his ruthlessness that drew them in. It was the power he had once commanded, the empire he had built and ruled, that made his story so compelling. In pop culture, the legend of Albert Anastasia began to morph into something else entirely. Books, movies, and documentaries soon followed, capturing the aura of his mystique and turning it into entertainment. The truth, however, became secondary to the narrative. He was portrayed as the quintessential gangster, the type of figure that audiences couldn't look away from. The violence, the power struggles, the betrayals, all of these elements were accentuated, making him seem larger than life, almost invincible. Over time, Anastasia's image became both a cautionary tale and a glorified myth. To some, he was a tragic hero, a man whose ambition ultimately led to his downfall. To others, he was a villain whose ruthless actions shaped the course of mafia history. But no matter the angle, his name endured. Albert Anastasia, the man who once ruled from the shadows, became an immortal figure, forever etched in the annals of criminal lore, a legend that would never fade. Albert Anastasia's legacy, woven into the very fabric of the mafia, endured far beyond his death. His violent methods and relentless pursuit of power became the blueprint for generations of mobsters who came after him. The fear and respect he commanded were tools that new crime figures adopted, shaping their own reigns. Though his violent actions were often seen as the mark of his era, his influence carried on like a dark shadow, deeply embedded in the way the mafia operated. In the years following Anastasia's assassination, his name became synonymous with brutality in the criminal world. The cold efficiency with which he carried out hits and maintained control over his territory became a model. His approach to violence, without hesitation or remorse, was not just about terror, it was about sending a message. The act of violence became an art form for those who followed in his footsteps. For them, violence wasn't just a tool, it was the language of the underworld. And Anastasia's mastery of that language was the gold standard. Young mobsters, eager to carve out their own place in the mafia, studied Anastasia's life closely. They understood that in order to succeed, they would need to be both feared and respected. His willingness to kill anyone who posed a threat, be it a rival or a traitor, sent a powerful signal to those in the world of organized crime. Anastasia's unwavering commitment to maintaining power, his willingness to sacrifice anyone who got in his way, became a lesson in survival. The new breed of criminals saw his fearlessness as an essential quality for anyone hoping to rise to the top. But beyond just violence, Anastasia also left behind a more subtle but equally powerful legacy. His mastery of manipulation, his ability to read people and bend them to his will, was something future mobsters aspired to replicate. He knew that the key to maintaining control wasn't just in the muscle, it was in the mind. His cunning in outmaneuvering rivals, his ability to play both sides when necessary, and his talent for pulling strings from the shadows were traits that shaped the thinking of those who followed him. Anastasia's impact on the mafia was not limited to the men who came after him. It stretched into the very fabric of how the mafia evolved over time. His death marked the end of one era, but it also paved the way for others to embrace the same cutthroat methods he had perfected. His legacy influenced not only those within his family but also other powerful criminal organizations across the country. The example he set, though ruthless, proved to be effective, one that would continue to resonate long after he had passed. In the underworld, where respect is everything, Anastasia's name lived on, his actions reverberating through the lives of those who would carry the torch of violence, power, and control. Even in the modern age, his methods and his mindset continue to shape the world of organized crime. For better or worse, Albert Anastasia's violent legacy is immortal. Albert Anastasia's name lingered in the dark corners of the criminal world long after his death. It became more than just a name. It became a symbol. As the years passed, the stories of his brutal reign and ruthless power spread like wildfire, whispered in the same breath as legends of mobsters gone by. To those in the know, his ghost was never truly gone. It lived in the shadows, a constant reminder of the price of ambition in the underworld. In the years following his death, his name was invoked in crime circles as a warning and a point of reverence. Aspiring mobsters, seeking to climb the ranks, would speak of Anastasia's reign like it was a myth, a tale of a man who ruled with an iron fist, and whose influence could silence even the most powerful enemies. His legacy served as both a template and a cautionary tale for those who thought they could rise above the streets without meeting the same violent end. Anastasia wouldn't have hesitated, they would mutter, invoking his name when faced with tough decisions, when the stakes were high and blood was on the line. Even as new figures came to the forefront of organized crime, Anastasia's name was never far from the lips of those who sought to emulate his style. His methods, violent and unforgiving, continued to be referenced in the planning of high-profile hits. His ruthless approach to consolidating power became the blueprint for future generations of criminals. To mention his name in a conversation was to acknowledge his mark on the game, the way he had bent the world of the mafia to his will. Though his empire was crumbling by the time of his death, his name endured, whispered by those who wanted to remind their rivals that there was always a way to make a statement, to show who truly held the power. But as much as his name was revered, it was also feared. His brutal methods of eliminating enemies, both inside and outside the family, became something of a legend. He had built a reputation that transcended time, and for those who still remembered him, it was the unspoken rule no one was ever really safe. In bars and back rooms, when someone dared to step out of line or challenge authority, they would hear, "You know what happened to the last guy who did that?" And Anastasia's name would echo through the room like a ghostly warning. Anastasia's shadow never truly faded from the criminal world. He became the embodiment of mafia power and violence, a symbol of a time when fear was the strongest weapon of all. To mention his name was to invoke both admiration and terror, a reflection of the man who had once ruled with such unrelenting force that even death could not erase his presence. Even in death, Albert Anastasia remained a ghost, haunting the underworld and casting his influence over the mafia for generations to come. Albert Anastasia, the murder artist, may have met his end in the quiet thrum of a final betrayal, but his story didn't die with him. Instead, it began a second life in the world of myth, film, and history. His violent rise to power, his chilling reign, and the calculated brutality that defined his every move became the stuff of legend, sanitized and spun into tales that both repelled and fascinated the public. The darkness of his life, his murders, and his manipulation of the underworld gave birth to a new kind of notoriety that outlasted his brutal existence. Over time, Albert Anastasia's name became synonymous not just with death, but with the allure of the underworld itself. In the years after his murder, Anastasia's life was romanticized in a way that obscured the cold-blooded nature of his actions. Films, documentaries, and books would tell the story of the feared hitman and his rise to power with such reverence that it became easy to forget the blood-soaked truth. The image of Anastasia morphed into something mythical, a figure who operated in the shadows, pulling strings, executing his enemies with icy precision. He became a symbol of raw power and ruthless ambition, his name one whispered in awe rather than fear. Media depictions often painted him as a man who lived outside the law, a necessary evil in a world ruled by corruption. His motivations were stripped of the deep-seated paranoia, the greed, the rage that consumed him. Instead, they depicted him as a tragic hero of sorts, a man caught between loyalty and the harsh reality of his chosen life. This distorted version of Anastasia painted him not as a monster, but as a figure to be admired for his survival skills, his unyielding control over his empire. His story was woven into the tapestry of organized crime like an ancient, unbreakable thread, and in the retelling, the darkness of his actions was softened by the passing of time. The public's fascination with him grew, turning Anastasia into a symbol of the mafia's golden age, a time when power could be seized by force, and men like him lived by a different code. His presence loomed large, not just in the underworld but in pop culture. References to him, whether in movies, books, or street gossip, carried with them a sense of awe, an understanding that Albert Anastasia was more than just a man. He was a force of nature, a harbinger of both destruction and order. In the end, Anastasia's legacy became a hybrid of fact and fiction, a combination of horror and fascination that spoke to humanity's need for both villain and hero. His crimes, once seen as monstrous, now stood as testament to the world he helped create. His rise, reign, and fall were stories retold, again and again, in an ever-evolving narrative that gave him immortality in a way he could never have anticipated, reduced to a myth. His bloody legacy immortalized, a murder artist reborn. Albert Anastasia lived his life in the shadows, a figure who never saw the world as others did, for whom daylight was just another weapon to conceal his intentions. From his early days in Italy to the streets of New York, he had been shaped by the darkness that enveloped him, the cold, calculated violence that ensured his rise to the top of the mafia's bloody hierarchy. Power was his compass, and violence was the language he spoke fluently. But even in the height of his dominance, there was never a moment of peace, never an end to the paranoia that gnawed at his insides. His world was built on trust that could be shattered in an instant, and every ally he made came with the cost of wondering when they would betray him. His enemies had always been closer than he thought, and betrayal was always lurking just beneath the surface. His life, marked by brutal decisions and relentless actions, was a tightrope walk between survival and destruction. Anastasia knew no other way to live, for power was his air, and violence was the current that kept him afloat. He created a myth, a legend forged in blood and cement, one that haunted the streets he controlled and the minds of those who knew his name. Yet, even as he sculpted his empire, he was nothing more than a shadow himself, a figure that loomed large in the world of organized crime, but never fully materialized into anything more than what others believed him to be. In the end, his life was not a story of triumph, but a cautionary tale about the cost of power. The very foundation he built his empire upon crumbled in the end, not from law enforcement or rival factions, but from the seeds of his own creation: trust betrayed, loyalty corrupted, and the ever-present threat of a world that turned on its own. Even the myth he had so carefully cultivated could not shield him from the inevitable. As the years passed and Anastasia became just another legend, his death became a footnote in a larger narrative. The world continued to turn, the mafia evolved, and the shadows where he once reigned grew colder. But his name still carried weight, still whispered in dark corners of the world he left behind. His legacy was neither a gift nor a curse, but a shadow that would never fully disappear. He was a man who lived in the dark, controlled by power and violence, and when the end came, it came silently. A man who never had the peace he so desperately sought, now sleeps in the same darkness he once ruled, leaving behind a world that can never quite forget him.